Chapter 2262. Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu traveled all over the Mountain Sea realm, and in between, they went to the Yuhuan heavens. After such a long time, it could be said that his main purpose had already been spread. Of course, this was only limited to the mortal metamorphosis level, and he himself didn't mind it. On the contrary, he could let others know of his intentions in advance, which could save him a lot of trouble. He said to the welcoming elder, "Thank you for waiting, fellow Taoist. Please lead the way." Elder Daoren didn't dare to say a word. He waved his hand, and a cloud raft descended. He made an inviting gesture and said, "Please follow me." Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu boarded the cloud raft, and the elder also walked up. He made a hand seal and floated up. Not long after, they passed through a heavenly gate on a cloud bridge. The two of them could feel that they had passed through a forbidden formation, and the scenery in front of them suddenly changed. Just now, the temples and towers could no longer be seen, and in their place was a towering cliff that seemed to be able to hold the moon and clouds. At the bottom of the cliff was an extremely vast turbid vortex that was constantly spinning. This kind of natural wonder might be very shocking in the eyes of ordinary people, but Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu were mortal metamorphosis cultivators, and they had seen countless magnificent sceneries in the heavens. Naturally, this kind of scene couldn't occupy too much of an impression in their minds. Therefore, they only gave a faint praise and didn't say anything else. The flying boat swept across the top of the cliff, then suddenly sank and rushed into the vortex. In just a few breaths' time, it broke out of the vortex, and what they saw below was a vast land. Countless broken grayish-white rocks dotted the land, and it looked desolate and lonely. The first level of the earth abyss could be said to be vast and boundless. Its size might be comparable to the land of the four continents. From here, it seemed that the spirit gate had a great advantage. However, the production of precious materials here was far inferior to the continent, and it wasn't going too far to say that it was barren and desolate. Moreover, this place was different from the bright and clear surface of the continent in the end. It was filled with a dim yellow color, and if one didn't possess an extremely high will and cultivation to suppress it, then one's mental state would probably warp and undergo some sort of change over time. Fortunately, the spirit sect cultivators could almost all be found here. If they went to the surface, they would have to compete with the cultivators of the celestial sect of wonders. Just thinking about it, they knew which choice was the best. Hong Yu, on the other hand, took a few more glances. Even though he knew that the current spirit gate posed no threat, he could not help but be vigilant in his heart. When he was a cultivator, the conflict between the profound and spirit sects ran deep. Even though he had severed his mortal body and no longer considered himself an elder of the primal Yang sect, he still instinctively placed himself in the position of a cultivator of the profound sect. Of course, he didn't mind doing so. He was well aware of this. He could feel that his understanding of his state of mind had never been so clear before. It was obvious that his Tao technique had improved greatly after the battles with his fellow Taoists and the continuous tempering of Shun Chang's divine decree. Moreover, this feeling was still rising. At that moment, the flying boat turned and headed east. Before long, they arrived in front of a large stone cave, where the flying boat landed. The elder in charge of welcoming guests said, "Esteemed guests, according to the rules of the Spirit Gate, you will have to walk to get there. Please forgive us." The two of them did not object. Each sect had its own rules, and as visitors, they naturally had to respect them. They disembarked from the flying boat and followed the elder into the stone cave. Inside, there was a wide passageway. Although it was clearly underground, and there were no immortal techniques, it was exceptionally bright. The two of them discovered that from here on out, there were many huge skeletons laid out on the ground. At a glance, they could tell that they had been left behind by the outsiders. As the light from above shone down, they looked sinister and ancient. Hong Yu only needed to look for a moment before he followed the skeletons to where they were. This was where the two tribes of the mountain and sea realm had fought and killed each other in ancient times. Ran Xiushu also saw it and asked curiously, "Why didn't your sect clear away these piles of skeletons?" The elder in charge of welcoming guests explained, "The elders of the sect believe that it was because of these native corpses that this realm was formed. That's why this place still retains its original appearance. Ran Xiushu suddenly said, "So that's how it is." In his heart, Hong Yu did not believe this reason. The elder in charge of welcoming guests was not telling the truth. Perhaps there were some other reasons for this. However, this was not important, and he was not in the mood to investigate the secrets of the Spirit Gate. Today, he had come here to rely on his condensed memories to compete with the photography master. There was no need for him to pay too much attention to other things that had nothing to do with him. The three of them walked out of the passageway, and the style of the scenery in front of them became familiar. There were pavilions, buildings, pagodas, and temples everywhere. Further away, there were countless heavenly ghost slaves moving mountains and stones to build altars. Ran Xiushu looked around and said in surprise, "Your sect has quite a lot of disciples." The elder in charge of welcoming guests, Daoren, said, "Actually, not many. It's just that all the disciples of the Spirit Gate are here." Ran Xiushu said, "I've traveled quite a bit this time, and I've seen many profound sects of the mountain and sea realm establish their own sects in other realms. However, I rarely saw any traces of the Spirit Gate. Is this your sect's intention? What other concerns do you have?" The elder in charge of welcoming guests did not answer immediately, as if he was asking for instructions. After a while, he said, "Our Spirit Gate could have spread its strength in the various realms when the Tao was cut off, but all of this was suppressed by Sect Master Yuan. The reason why Yuan Hongyang did this was not because he was worried that the Spirit Gate would clash with profound sects of the righteous path like the Anatta Temple, but because it was difficult for the Spirit Gate to integrate into the mainstream of cultivation in the various realms, whether it was in terms of reputation or conduct. Moreover, there were still some problems in terms of cultivation that needed to be resolved. The various sect masters of the Spirit Gate also knew that other than the Netherworld Spring sect, even if the other sects of the Spirit Gate managed to expand, many of their disciples' mental states were flawed. Once they left the restraints of the sects, it was very likely that they would get into trouble, and this would damage the reputation of the Spirit Gate. Therefore, the upper echelons of the various sects chose to tolerate this. They were all waiting for the day Yuan Hongyang came out of closed-door cultivation. If he became a true young expert, then not only would the problem of cultivation techniques be solved, but the strength of the Spirit Gate would also naturally be able to expand. As the three of them walked, a chi rainbow suddenly came directly under their feet. The elder in charge of welcoming guests, Daoren, greeted them and took the lead. Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu stepped onto the rainbow bridge and felt as if they had entered a teleportation altar. In just a flash, they had arrived on a large platform. Hong Yu looked over and saw the hazy clouds on the platform. 3 Taoist figures stood there, and one of them was dressed in a yellow robe. His aura was unfathomable, as if he was floating above the 9 heavens, but at the same time he was hiding under the Yuan region. It was the Netherworld Spring Sect Master, Yuan Hongyang. However, he had long heard that Yuan Hongyang was in closed-door cultivation to comprehend the true Xian, and the one in front of him was only a clone. However, he had met many of his peers, and even though he was only seeing a clone, he could tell that Yuan Hongyang had already cultivated his Tao to an exquisite level. When his gaze shifted to the face of the Taoist on the left, his expression slightly froze. He discovered that he couldn't see through this person's external appearance, and every time he tried to recall, the person in his memory would change appearance. He understood that this was the Origin Mirage Sect Master, Xue Dingyuan, and also the person he was looking for. The one on the right was a delicate and handsome young Taoist. He was dressed in a dark red smoky robe, and his skin was like jade. He could be said to be incomparably handsome, and among the 3, he had the most immortal-like aura. He should be the Blood Soul Sect Master, Su Muqing. At this moment, the 3 people in front of them were also sizing up the 2 of them, but most of their gazes fell on Hong Yu. As they observed each other, he and Ran Xiushu had already come forward to greet the 3 of them. Then they chatted for a while and briefly discussed Tao. At this time, Yuan Hongyang said, "This time, fellow Taoist Hong Yu has come to find Sect Master Xue, so Sect Master Su and I will not usurp the host's place." Xue Dingyuan cupped his hands and said, "Fellow Taoist Hong Yu, fellow Taoist Ran, please follow me." With a wave of his sleeve, everyone present was moved to a realm that seemed illusory yet real. He then pointed. That is the origin Mirage Sect's treasure, the great spiritual steel of heart imagery. Hong Yu looked over and saw that it was a stone steel the size of a mountain. It was simple and heavy, and there was nothing special about it from its appearance. Shui Dingyuan said, "Fellow Taoist Hong Yu, I have to remind you that the great spiritual steel may not be able to carry that person's memory. Have you thought about what to do?" This stone steel was left behind by the Origin Mirage Sect's founder, but this great spiritual steel was obtained by someone in the West Sea, so it was very likely to be something that belonged to a West Continent cultivator in the past. Even though Shui Dingyuan's current level far surpassed the founder of the sect, he could not completely see through this object. However, he also did not think that this object could surpass the Grand Supreme Tao ancestor. If Hong Yu did not have a good idea, he would not allow him to send that person's memory into it. Hong Yu cupped his hands and said, "Rest assured, fellow Taoist. Before coming here, I have already set up an altar and offered incense to Xinyuan heaven. There should be no hindrance here." Shui Dingyuan nodded and took a step to the side. Hong Yu did not immediately step forward. Instead, he closed his eyes and kept thinking about the opponents he had encountered in the past. The opponents that were able to be left behind by him in the divine will were all impressive figures. Right now, the silhouettes of these people were only created by his divine will, so their cultivation would not improve. However, as his Tao improved, he would be able to kill most of them one by one. Even if there were some strong enemies that were hard to deal with, he would still be able to maintain a stalemate. As he continued to do so, the essence, qi, and spirit in his body climbed to the peak. The two swords on his back shone with yin and yang light and constantly vibrated. Unknowingly, the shackles that firmly bound him were loosening. After a long time, the movements of the two swords finally calmed down. The light faded, and everything returned to normal. He opened his eyes. His essence, qi, and spirit had become incomparably full. Although Shun Chang's perfect fusion of one technique in the divine decree had not been truly broken, the barrier in his heart had been temporarily suppressed. At this moment, he was once again standing at the peak. Not only that, after the previous experience, after removing the shackles, he was stronger than ever before. He looked at the great spiritual steel with an unprecedented sharpness in his eyes. He then took a step inside. Chapter 2263. Su Muqing was curious as he watched Hong Yu walk toward the great spiritual steel. He entered the Tao late and did not participate in the battle of the 9 continents human tribulation, so he could only learn about the past from records and past divine wills. However, this was different from actually participating in the battle, and he could not understand the magical abilities of the combatants, which made him feel regretful. He and Zhang Yan naturally did not have any experience in discussing Tao, but Shui Dingyuan and Yuan Hongyang had both experienced the battle of the 3 tribulations, so he asked, "Sect Master Shui, you've interacted a lot with that person. What will be the result of fellow Taoist Hong Yu's trip?" Shui Dingyuan pondered for a while and said, "I don't know how much knowledge fellow Taoist Hong Yu has obtained from that person. Sometimes, a little less will make a big difference, but no matter what, that person will not lose." Su Muqing thought for a while and nodded. That person was the Taishang Taoist ancestor, so he naturally had to maintain his respect. Not to mention that Hong Yu could not win, even if he could, he would not dare to. Yuan Hongyang's gaze was deep and distant as he said, "Fellow Taoist Hong Yu is not here to win, but to fight for Tao. Therefore, the result of this trip is not important, and it depends on how much he can gain." At this moment, Hong Yu had already walked into the great spiritual steel, and he felt very strange. It was not his spirit or divine will that entered, but his whole body. This place could not be said to be a world of its own, and it was as if he had signed an agreement with something to be able to enter. He tried to explore and felt something, but he could not grasp the main point. However, he did not come here to find the secret of this place. Since he could not find any clues after a glance, he just passed by as an ordinary scenery. He calmed his mind and felt a mysterious consciousness surging over, attracting him to take a look. He immediately understood that this place was divided into two layers, the inner and outer layer. Standing in his current position, he could not see anything, and only by entering the inner layer could he see the opponent's reflection. This arrangement was not useless, but it was for the purpose of protecting oneself. Without this buffer, once one lost to the projection, they would be directly sent out of the Great Spirit Steel. Their magic power and mind would be shaken, and if the cultivator's cultivation was high, it was very likely that the Spirit Steel itself would be damaged. He nodded. He could see that if a disciple of the Origin Mirage Gate came here, they could repeatedly train here and fight with their opponents without paying too much of a price. The key point was that even a cultivator like him who had severed his past and future self could bear this treasure, so it was quite extraordinary. It was no wonder that it was listed as the sect's cornerstone treasure. However, he felt that the Great Spirit Steel should not be limited to just this. There must be many changes that had yet to be revealed, perhaps only the cultivators of the Yuan Mirage sect knew about it. Through the consciousness that was transmitted over, he already understood that he still needed to send the memories that he had pieced together earlier into this place in order to appear. However, he did not do so immediately. This Great Spirit Steel was rumored to be able to reflect any opponent in one's heart. It was difficult to obtain this, so he could first use the image of others to try and understand some of the changes here. Only then would he be able to face that person's reflection in a better state. However, an opponent that was too powerful was not suitable for him to use it now. It was not that he was afraid, but he was afraid that his spirit would be worn down too much, which would be detrimental to future battles. Thus, with a thought, a golden-robed Taoist wearing a golden lotus crown appeared. His lips were tightly pursed, and there was a trace of stubbornness in his eyes. This was a fellow disciple of the Yuan Yang sect, and his cultivation was also very high. In the Yuan Yang sect, he did not follow the practice of cultivating together with his Tao companion, but instead created his own Tao. However, in the end, he did not succeed, and only left behind a scroll before he severed his body and left. This person could be said to have an extremely profound influence on his path of Tao. It was precisely because he saw this trace of possibility that he was able to avoid many detours. Now that this person's figure appeared in front of him again, he bowed and said, "Fellow, long time no see." Like a real person, the Taoist bowed back, and there was a trace of joy in his voice as he said, "I could not walk the path, but fellow has walked it. This path is indeed feasible." At this moment, Hong Yu found that his cultivation had returned to the Yuanying stage, and he was no different from the Taoist in front of him. He was not surprised at all. He gently raised his hand, and the shape of a sword condensed in his hand. He said, "Fellow, please." The Taoist's expression also became solemn. He said, "Please." The two of them had the same cultivation, but their understanding of Tao and the use of sword techniques were like heaven and earth. After only a few rounds, the Taoist was already defeated, but he did not feel the slightest bit unwilling. Instead, he looked at Hong Yu with a smile and said in a gratified tone, "Thank you, fellow, for making up for my regret." Hong Yu silently nodded as he watched the Taoist's figure slowly disappear. Although he knew that none of this was real, and it seemed like such an action was meaningless, he was still willing to do it. At this moment he understood a little. For someone he was familiar with, if there was no other person's memories to supplement it, he could only use everything he remembered. The Great Spirit Tablet controlled everything here, so for fairness, the two of them had to be at the same level. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, another tall and dignified cultivator walked out from the crowd. This was the opponent he had encountered in the Yuan Heavens. This person had some skill, and in terms of battle ability, he could be ranked at the top. This person did not have much of a relationship with him, so he immediately swung his sword at him. After exchanging a few blows seriously, he easily defeated this person. Although the Taoist was not his match when he fought with him earlier, it was not so easy. He was certain that the Taoist had fully displayed the Taoist's divine abilities here. This undoubtedly meant that he had indeed recovered, and no matter if it was his Fa Li or cultivation, they had all improved. At his level, even the slightest bit of improvement was difficult. It was precisely because of this that he continuously used battle to train himself, to search for his flaws, and then to make up for them bit by bit. After fighting two people consecutively, he had tested the changes here. It was indeed as he wished, so he no longer hesitated. With a thought, he sent out the memories he had gathered. He did not know how much he could piece together, but the person who had provided the memories had either come into contact with that person before, or had personally witnessed their battle. Even if they were not all the same, they should not be far off. A moment later, the figure of a black-robed Taoist condensed. Perhaps his memories were not enough, or perhaps the other's level was too high, so he could not clearly see the other's appearance. However, he did not need to do so. It was fine as long as he could ask the other for advice. At this moment, he subconsciously took a deep breath, and the slightly rippling lake of his heart returned to a flat mirror. When a mortal transformation cultivator severed their physical body, only their avatar remained, so they naturally did not need to breathe. However, the avatar was a copy of the physical body, so some habits would naturally come with it. Some would erase it altogether, while others were willing to keep it. Of course, the prerequisite was that it did not affect their own battle. This was done to maintain the human nature of the human heart. Without these, it was no different from the heartless path. He naturally chose to keep these habits, so when his spirit was at a high level, he would naturally continue these habits. After adjusting himself, the desire to fight rose in his heart. The shadow seemed to have felt it as well. It stood where it was without moving, but a torrent of qi rose under its feet and pressed towards him. Hong Yu instantly felt an endless amount of qi pressing down on him. There were no changes here, and it was the purest power. It was as if it could crush him the moment it touched him. He was shocked, and did not dare to block it head-on. Instead, he retreated to the outer layer. As he retreated, the qi also retracted, and then disappeared without a trace. He could not help but fall into silence. Of all the cultivators he had seen, there was not one with such strong qi. Under such powerful qi, no matter what kind of transformation technique one used, it was useless. If Shen Chang's unity was a counter to qi, then this was a counter to qi in terms of power. However, this did not mean that there could not be any changes in power. It meant that one could defeat their opponent without these changes. In other words, the opponent's power could not trigger any changes here. By the same logic, qi also needed to be supported by power. Without enough power, one could not support any changes. Which of the two was better, at least with his current cultivation, he could not tell. However, he knew one thing. The person before him was not only powerful in qi, he had many other techniques as well. However, if that was the case, no matter how many times he went up, he would be crushed by the qi. He would not be able to achieve his original goal of asking for advice. He thought about it and bowed. I have heard that the Overlord's swordsmanship is great. I hope you can help me. Then he waited for a while and walked in again. He carefully triggered his desire to fight. As if his prayer had come true, this time, the shadow did not directly summon the qi to greet him. Instead, with a clear cry, a sword light soared up and floated in the air. Hong Yu's spirit was lifted. He knew that this person was skilled in swordsmanship. Especially when he visited the Shaoqing sect, many Shaoqing Shangjin who had interacted with this person noticed this. It could be said that the path of swordsmanship was the clearest among the many memories. Hong Yu was most skilled in swordsmanship. Although the sword pellet was different from the qi sword, they were both swords in essence. They were only different in terms of direction and transformation. This kind of contest was exactly what he hoped for. As if it had sensed his wish, the sword light turned and slashed at him. This was an extremely sharp sword light. The moment Hong Yu saw it, he felt as if that clear brilliance had shone into the depths of his mind. What the heart saw was what the spirit saw. Without waiting for him to think, the yin-yang swords on his back shook and leaped out of their sheaths in unison, slashing towards that sword light. However, before his swords and the sword light came into contact, his vision blurred. Then, he realized that he had already retreated to the outer layer. He could not help but feel shocked. However, this result clearly meant that he had already been defeated in the instant they exchanged blows. But he had no idea how he had lost. When he calmed down, he deduced a seemingly impossible answer. The moment he saw the sword light, He had already been killed. However, this result confused him. He clearly had the protection of the root fruit, so why was the outcome decided in an instant? Chapter 2264. Hong Yu stood where he was and pondered, but no matter how he thought about it, he could not understand what was going on just now. Just like Shen Chang's fuse into one, if Shen Chong didn't explain it, then he wouldn't be able to understand it. Because this had already exceeded his understanding. If it was the first time he encountered such an incident, then perhaps his mind and vital energy would be injured just like the last time, and it would affect his body. But after experiencing a similar situation once, he once again stood at the peak, and could very calmly accept this kind of thing. Perhaps the most important reason was that although his opponent this time was only a reflection, he was still an upper realm almighty, so losing to an almighty was undoubtedly reasonable and not that hard to accept. At this moment, a thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Could it be that his failure was due to the interference of an almighty? If that was the case, even 100 of him would be useless. But this thought was immediately extinguished by him. It was not that he was afraid, but since the Almighty had allowed him to see the reflection, then he would not do such a meaningless thing, or else this matter would be cut off from the source. Moreover, with Shen Chang's previous move, he understood that in this realm, there were indeed some methods that others could not see through. If it was before, he could go back and calculate the wonders of this move, but now he could not, because he did not dare to let this person's reflection appear in his divine will at all. But he did not retreat because of this. Instead, unparalleled fighting spirit shone. There was an incredibly powerful opponent here that he could repeatedly ask for advice. This was a rare opportunity, and he would not be injured here at all, so what else could he ask for? If he could not understand it the first time, then he would try it the second time, and if he could not understand it the second time, then he would try it the third time, and if he failed too many times, then he would naturally be able to find out the reason. Thinking of this, he adjusted his mind and chi activity, and once again stepped into the inner layer. Then he repeatedly entered 16 times, and was defeated in one move every time. It was the same every time, and when the sword light appeared, life and death were already decided. Although he could not see the true wonders of the sword light every time he failed, he saw some of his own inadequacies from it. Being defeated by an opponent was ultimately his own fault, because as long as he did not have any flaws, and was even perfect, he would not be defeated in one blow. However, he also understood that the Yuan Mirage Gate was able to agree to this matter this time. Firstly, it was because they were fellow Taoists, and secondly, he had Ran Xiushu to accompany him. After all, he had to give face to the Shaoqing sect elder. Thirdly, it was very likely that he agreed to it after seeing that the other person did not stop him. However, it was impossible for him to use the ultimate treasure of the Origin Mirage Gate endlessly. There was bound to be a limit to the number of times he could use it, so he especially cherished every opportunity. After retreating in defeat, he would reflect on himself and try to find his own shortcomings. After 36 attempts, he found that he could no longer take another step forward. He knew that he could no longer continue, so he turned around and walked out of the Great Spirit Steel. Seeing that everybody was still waiting outside, he cupped his fists and said, "I have troubled everybody to wait for a long time. It was really impolite of me. Please do not take it to heart." He solemnly bowed to Xue Dingyuan and said, "Many thanks to sect leader Xue." Xue Dingyuan returned the greeting and said, "You're too polite, fellow Taoist." Although everyone present was curious about the final outcome, they did not ask when they saw that Hong Yu had no intention of taking the initiative to speak. At this moment, Hong Yu said, "I don't have anything in return for gaining permission to enter this place, but I do know a piece of news, so I'll give it to all of you." After saying a few words to Yuan Hongyang and the other two, he bid farewell to them. Xue Dingyuan personally saw the two of them off. When he returned, he asked, "What do sect leader Yuan and sect leader Su think about this matter?" Yuan Hongyang said, "Zhou Huan Yuan Jade can pass through the upper boundary. If the two of you are interested, you can go there and seek your fortune." Su Muqing smiled lightly and said, "I haven't reached the required level yet, so I won't join in the fun. Sect leader Xue, on the other hand, can give it a try." Xue Dingyuan thought about it carefully and finally said, I won't go. He looked at the two of them and said, It's not that I don't want to compete, but the heavens operate and have their own destinies. Fortune is determined by the heavens, not by me. Yuan Hongyang nodded slightly and said, Since you've obtained immortality, you should first enjoy peace and then search for the heavenly secrets. You'll eventually have a chance if you keep waiting. Su Muqing was deep in thought. His cultivation was not as profound as the two of them, but it was not difficult for him to deduce what was behind these words. However, he still somewhat admired Xue Dingyuan. Sometimes, even if a cultivator could already see the result, they could not help but do it for the sake of fighting for that 1 in a million chance. Especially when it came to matters that involved the upper realm, few people could endure it. Moreover, with Xue Dingyuan's cultivation base, there shouldn't be any danger in this trip. Yet, he was still calm and motionless without the slightest hesitation. Sure enough, he was worthy of being one of the few people who survived the human tribulation of the 9 regions. However, those who fought for this item would definitely be those cultivators who stood at the top of the heavens, so it did not prevent him from observing it. On the other side, Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu had already left the abyss. Ran Xiushu asked, Fellow Taoist Hong Yu, where are you going? Hong Yu said in a deep voice, I might go to the mysterious mirror world. Ran Xiushu asked, to fight for the primordial jade? Hong Yu shook his head and said, I'm not asking for the primordial jade, but I will definitely meet many opponents there. He paused for a while and continued, This time, I learned that there are still many shortcomings in my cultivation. In the past, I thought that I was brilliant, but it was also full of flaws. I can only continue to polish myself in order to perfect my cultivation. When Ran Xiushu heard this, he knew the result, but it was also within his expectations. He asked curiously, What did you gain this time? Hong Yu was silent for a while, then said, It's hard for me to say, why don't you take a look? He glanced at Ran Xiushu, and entered the wisp of sword light that he saw just now into Ran Xiushu's divine decree. However, there was no blurry figure in it, nor was there any process. In fact, it was impossible to see anything from the sword light on the surface, but that was all he could recall. If he took another step forward, he could faintly feel that something bad would happen to him. When Ran Xiushu saw the wisp of sword light, he was startled, and then he fell into deep thought. Hong Yu didn't say anything, and only waited calmly at the side. After a long time, Ran Xiushu just now came back to his senses, smiled at Hong Yu, and said, Fellow Taoist, this is the end of the journey, I'll go back now. Oh right. He slapped his forehead, as if he remembered something, and complained to Hong Yu, Fellow Taoist, you should also take in a disciple. Otherwise, without a junior by your side, how can you show off your power? Hong Yu was a serious person, but when he heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. Ran Xiushu also laughed and said, Fellow Taoist Hong Yu, I'll take my leave. If you're bored, you can come find me for a sword duel. After saying this, he instantly turned into a flowing light and disappeared. Hong Yu looked at the vast and endless galaxy in the night sky, and murmured, Take in a disciple? He lowered his head and thought for a while, then slowly said, That's a good idea. He had been pursuing battles with Dao techniques all his life, constantly challenging strong opponents, but he had never really calmed down to sort out his Dao techniques. It could be said that all his problems were discovered in battles with enemies, but some of his shortcomings and flaws could be corrected by himself, and he didn't have to rely on external sources. Moreover, he had gained a lot this time, and he needed to digest too many things. Moreover, he faintly felt that the reason why some places were difficult for him to advance was probably because there was a problem at the root. He wasn't afraid of problems, but he was afraid of not being able to find them. If that was the case, he could very well take in some disciples under his sect. Imparting techniques wasn't the goal, but the means. Perhaps by observing the disciples' cultivation, he could see more things. He was a person who did what he thought. Therefore, he used his Fa Li and continuously teleported several times. Finally, he appeared in a large desert. In the almost unchanging scenery, there were undulating and winding golden-white sand piles. This was the southern part of the 100 continents of the South Civ, where the heat was unbearably hot, like a hell of fire. It was truly a place where no living creatures could be found. However, as he looked through the layers of sand, he could see raging rivers flowing down below, as well as countless twisting ravines. That was the perfect place for his disciples to live. The entire 100 continents of the South Civ were governed by the demon kind, which had been intentionally left behind when the various sects of the 9 continents had first occupied the mountain and sea realm. First of all, not many sects had occupied such a vast territory, and second of all, the presence of the demon kind would allow them to fight the eastern wasteland savages. Of course, there was no need for that now. The mountain and sea realm itself was vast, and could be passed through anywhere in the heavens. Therefore, there was no need to keep an eye on this place. The reason he had chosen this place to teach his disciples was because it was a cruel and ever-changing place. Furthermore, the outside world was filled with outsiders and demon kind, which made it even easier to hone one's cultivation. The only downside was that this place was far away from the other sects, and could be described as an isolated island. However, that wasn't a problem. He could set up a teleportation Dharma altar here, which he could use to communicate with the outside world. Based on his cultivation base, he might not be able to set up something like that in the myriad of heavens, but he could easily teleport it to the mountain and sea realm. After setting up a Taoist rite temple underground, he went to the other 3 continents to look for suitable disciples. He didn't like the mountain and sea realm savages, but he wanted to teach the reincarnated people of the 9 continents. He didn't want to owe any favors to the various sects, and therefore, after spending half a year searching for 20 or so children, he brought them back to the great sand sea of the South Reaches. He was only here to teach them Taoist magics, not to establish a sect, nor to restore the primal Yang Taoist tradition. Primal Yang was a thing of the past, and his path had been born from it. However, the later stages were completely different. Not even the founder of the primal Yang Taoist sect would be as powerful as he was now, and therefore, it wasn't worth his while. However, there was one thing that he didn't forget. In order to teach Taoist magics, the tablets of Yuan Zun had to be worshipped. Although the creator of Yuan Zun wouldn't necessarily care about you, you couldn't disrespect him. Furthermore, there were rules for the placement of the tablets. In the middle was the tablet of Tao's sovereign Shenyuan, followed by the other 3. If they didn't do that, the other tablets of Yuan Zun would be destroyed. Therefore, it was tacitly agreed that this tablet was the most venerated. As for Taoist Wan Ke, who no one knew about, he was an exception. After he led the disciples in paying respects to the tablets, he saw a flicker of light on the tablets. Knowing that there was nothing to worry about, he began to teach Taoist magics. Chapter 2265. In the silence, the wills of Xiangju and the others were immersed in the grand world domain that they had created together. With all their efforts, they finally found another land of creation. Although it could not be compared to Bu Su Tian and Mirror Lake, its vastness surpassed any of the places they had found before. Originally, this place was enough to be a place for them to stay. However, once the grand world domain was formed, it was destined that they could not have this place to themselves. It could only continue to be connected to the world. However, this was undoubtedly an enormous breakthrough. After all, the places of fortune were becoming more and more difficult to find. Earlier, no matter how they searched, they'd only obtained very little results. Yet now, this outcome showed that so long as they searched along this path, then they would definitely be able to find even more places of fortune. But just as they were about to continue, they discovered something and had no choice but to stop. Originally, they had intercepted the great power of the spirit of creation that was drawn over. They either wore it down or expelled it. However, without any warning, the great power surging towards the purple-clothed Taoist increased by several times. This made it impossible for them to resolve it. Even though the purple-robed Taoist's consciousness and magic power were sealed, he still instinctively absorbed the Weili into his body. His qi activity rose faintly. But Xiangju and the others had been suppressing him with the Weili and were always on guard against any changes. There was also Taoist Feng Du watching from the side. So even if the Weili surged at this moment, they could not do anything. In fact, under the current arrangement, not to mention the purple-robed Taoist, Even the original incarnation of the Whaley spirit of creation would not be able to escape if it was trapped here. Out of consideration, Xiangju reminded them, although we can suppress him in front of us, you still have to be careful. Hongdu sneered, let him come. If he dares to reassemble, I will be more than happy to let him go. Xiangju did not respond. Although he did not know the purpose of the Whaley spirit of creation's response, it was definitely not to reassemble his incarnation. Perhaps he was hiding something by making such a big commotion. Wei Ming frowned and said, no matter what, this spirit of creation Whaley is getting harder and harder to deal with. When he first recruited the Whaley, things went smoothly. However, when the Whaley realized that the recruitment was disadvantageous to them, they began to resist. In the past, he only needed to gently guide the Whaley out, but now it was extremely difficult. He had to pull them out bit by bit. Zhang Yan had also seen the unusual movements of these Whaley in Qinghuan Palace. He made a slight calculation, and immediately and accurately deduced that this change was the spirit of creation. The Whaley were once again rebelling, and they were preparing to attack from the lower levels to break through the barriers of the upper levels. However, the Whaley were not living beings and only knew how to search for gaps. Therefore, this kind of response was stiff and not of much use. At most, it could push the spirit of creation within the all things to ascend into the world. However, a single piece of primordial jade was enough to completely obstruct this generation. However, there was one person that he needed to pay attention to. This person was already standing at the door of the upper realm. As long as he took that step, it was possible for him to break through. He turned his gaze and looked at Danny. Although he had the intention to ascend to the upper realm, this was not a small matter. Moreover, he had not made such preparations before, or rather, he was adjusting his state of mind. This was because ascending to the upper realm was very dangerous. For example, Taoist 1K had clearly gone halfway, but because he was afraid of unfathomable changes, he had retreated, causing his Dharma body to collapse. However, the strange movements of the spirit of creation Whaley forced him to increase his original resistance. Especially this time, most of the Whaley's response had fallen on him. This also made him understand that perhaps he had never been fully prepared for this kind of thing. Only by stepping over it could he break free from the pressure of this power. After having this understanding in his state of mind, he also firmed his resolve and decided to try to take that step. Zhang Yan was not afraid that he would take the wrong path, because if he was controlled by the spirit of creation Whaley, it would conflict with his own will, and the results would not be complete. At that time, his body and soul would definitely be destroyed, and he would not be able to reach that step. Therefore, only by sticking to his own path and sticking to it, would he have the hope of breaking through to the upper realm. This could only rely on himself. Now, it depended on whether he could persevere to the end. Kuan-Shi continent, inside the Yen sect's branch altar. Gaogua received a message from the main altar and her expression turned solemn. She immediately sent someone to summon Meng Hu before her and said, Guardian Meng, it is highly possible that the primordial jade will descend into the world at the location of the mysterious mirror's branch altar. The people of the myriad of worlds are all heading towards that place. My Yin Jiao cannot miss the opportunity. The sect master has specially issued a decree to summon you and the other outstanding talents from the other altars to head over there to try your luck. You should make some preparations and depart for that place in the next few days. Even though your cultivation is slightly insufficient at the moment, you can try to improve yourself when you get there. It did not matter where Meng Hu went. Moreover, he had also stayed in the Xian Mirror Branch altar for a long time, and it was not an unfamiliar place. He immediately agreed. However, after the branch altar master He Xianren knew about this, he was a little dissatisfied. He believed that he and Meng Hu had a tacit understanding. After Meng Hu left, he would definitely use someone else to be the chief protector. Another person might not be so harmonious with him. Therefore, he immediately found Gaogua and complained. In the end, he said, the matters of the Kuan-Shi continent are inseparable from Protector Meng. How can I do things if the main altar transfers him away at this time? Gaogua said solemnly, this is an important matter of the main altar. The sect ancestor has personally issued a decree. Whether you agree or not, you have to accept it. Speaking up to this point, he changed the topic and said, "You don't have to worry. Protector Meng is still the chief protector of the Kuan Shi branch altar. When the matter is over, he will be transferred back. During this period, the main altar will first send a suitable person to replace the position of chief protector. The main altar can also understand your difficulties. It's fine as long as you can guarantee that nothing will happen during this period." He Xianren had no choice but to accept it, but he still expressed that Meng Hu should return as soon as possible. After Meng Hu received the decree, he simply packed up and crossed the realm gate alone with a civet cat in his arms. He came to the Xian Mirror branch altar. There was already a deacon here who had received the decree to welcome him and bring him into the branch altar. The deacon smiled and said, "The courtyard that Chief Protector Meng used to live in is still here, but Chief Protector Meng's status is different now. If you don't like it, we can order for it to be changed." Meng Hu sighed deeply and said, "It's fine as it is. Who asked me to be so nostalgic?" The deacon laughed a few times and invited Meng Hu into his original residence. However, the latter did not let him go. Instead, he pulled him along and asked many questions. Many of these questions were inexplicable. He was afraid that there was some hidden meaning in them, so he could only raise his spirits and deal with them carefully. When he finally came out, he was already mentally and physically exhausted. At this moment, he raised his head and saw two Taoists coming together. They looked unfamiliar, and at a glance, he knew that they were not from the branch altar. He shouted, "Where did you come from?" One of them hurriedly came out and bowed, saying, "Fellow Taoist, both of us are old friends of Protector Meng. This time, we heard that he has returned, so we specially came to visit." These two people were Duan Yi and Taoist Shi. Earlier, after they sent a letter requesting to be attached, the two of them originally only held the possibility of giving it a try. They did not expect that the sect would really accept them. They instinctively thought that it was Meng Hu's contribution, and couldn't help but have a new understanding of this Protector Meng's ability. Just now, they had only arrived at the mysterious realm branch altar for a few days. When they heard that Meng Hu had returned, they were very surprised. Because they had already decided to follow this person closely, they hurriedly came to pay a visit. The deacon was still considered polite. He reminded them and said, "You too, now you should not call him Protector Meng. You should call him Chief Protector Meng." The two of them immediately understood and said, "Yes, yes, thank you for your advice." The deacon continued, "Chief Protector Meng has traveled here from another branch altar and also dealt with a lot of mundane affairs. It has been quite exhausting. When I came out, I was already preparing to meditate and adjust my breathing. I am afraid that I have no time to see you two for the time being. I hope that you two can forgive me. However, when the time is right, come and ask me again. I will naturally report for you too." Taoist Shi immediately said, "So that's how it is. We came at the wrong time, then we will not disturb Chief Protector Meng." After saying that, he cupped his hands and bowed before pulling Duan Yi away. On the way back, Duan Yi angrily said, "Just now, it is clear that despicable person saw that I am not a member of the branch altar and deliberately wanted to bully us." Taoist Shi advised, "Living under someone else's charity is like this. It is already not bad that the sect didn't punish us. As long as we are still in the branch altar these few days, we will be able to see Protector Meng. At that time, you and I will also have someone to rely on." After the deacon left, Meng Hu let out a sound of surprise. He realized that there was some kind of change in his heart realm. He couldn't help but be extremely surprised and immediately turned to look inside. As soon as he entered the heart realm, he saw a Daoran sitting upright with a horsetail whisk in his hand. Seeing him come in, the Daoran cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist, you and I meet again." Meng Hu looked at him with a few puzzled eyes. Then, he came to a realization and pointed, "You, it is you." Daoran nodded and said, "Yes, yes, it is me." Meng Hu was greatly shocked and said, "So you have been here all this time? I have actually raised you for so long for nothing?" Daoran choked. He forced a smile and said, "You and I are one. Why do you say that?" In order to prevent Meng Hu from continuing, he hurriedly changed the topic and said, "Fellow Taoist, The reason why I've appeared today is because there's an extremely rare opportunity in front of you. It all depends on whether fellow Taoist can seize it or not. Rare opportunity? Hearing that, Meng Hu became excited and said, "Tell me about it." Doran's expression turned serious and said, "Now that the Zhou Huanyuan jade is about to enter the world, perhaps others can only let this item choose freely, but fellow Taoist is the spirit of creation who was born into the world, and the Zhou Huanyuan jade is formed from the essence of creation. It can be considered to be of the same origin as you. If you use your Tao technique to sense it, there is a great chance that you can obtain this item. As long as you refine it, there will be no more obstacles in the future for fellow Taoist." Meng Hu's eyes lit up and said, "You are saying that as long as I use my Tao technique and seize the Weili, I will be able to obtain the Zhou Huanyuan jade?" "Yes, yes." Daoran nodded repeatedly and said in a bewitching tone, "Fellow Taoist, why don't you give it a try? You only need to use your technique slightly and you will know that what I said is true." Chapter 2266. Hearing Doran's words, Meng Hu touched his chin and said, "So that's how it is. This is easy, I'll give it a try." Daoran smiled, but the depth of his eyes was deep and unfathomable. Meng Hu sat down cross-legged and calmed his mind. Just as he was about to circulate his cultivation method, he suddenly raised his head and looked at the Taoist, saying, "Is there something wrong?" Doran's expression did not change. He still had that warm smile on his face and said, "What do you think is wrong?" Meng Hu made a sound of understanding and said, "Oh, so there's nothing wrong." He immediately circulated his cultivation method, but after a while, there was no movement. He muttered, "It's the same as before, there's not much change." Daoran coughed and said, "No, this cultivation method cannot be based on your own cultivation method, it needs to be attached to the original cultivation method, only then it can be successful." Meng Hu said with dissatisfaction, "Why not the cultivation method and obey me?" Daoran said, "That's because only by obeying the cultivation method, one's body is emotionless and spiritless, and oneself is empty. In this way, the primordial jade may be attached to you just now. If you only do it for yourself, it may also attract the primordial jade, but at that time, even if the door is opened, it will still choose you, and not attract it with the cultivation method." At this point, his tone became heavier. "Fellow Taoist, I have to say that you have gone on the wrong path before, but it's not too late to return to the original path. You must know that the spirit of creation Weili is everywhere, and only by submitting to this power can you listen to the supreme great Tao." Meng Hu did not believe him and said, "Don't lie to me that I've never seen the world. I've met a few people who submitted to the cultivation method before, but they were not that powerful." The old Taoist said, "That's because they didn't really submit to Tao techniques, or they aren't the spirits of creation. The Tao techniques they obtained are incomplete. If Taoists were to submit, then your attainments would definitely be above them." Unconvinced, Meng Hu said, "That doesn't mean that the method of one's own Tao is weaker than the method of submission." Daoran smiled and said, "It's not hard to make a comparison. Fellow Taoist and I are one, but in terms of Tao, I am superior to you." Meng Hu was shocked. "Really?" Daoran smiled and said, "If you don't believe me, why don't we discuss Tao and you'll know that I'm not lying." Meng Hu thought for a moment and nodded seriously. Then he stood up, and under the astonished gazes of Daoran and the others, he slapped down with his palm. With a single slap, Meng Hu's silhouette dissipated. He said proudly, "I knew you weren't as powerful as me." Seeing that the Taoist did not appear again, he nodded in satisfaction and left the heart realm. On the second day, altar leader Xianjing brought a few protectors to personally pay a visit. It was considered to be sufficient etiquette, and after that, no one came to disturb them. Meng Hu followed Gaogua's instructions and adjusted his breathing and channeled his qi, striving to cultivate his qi to perfection as soon as possible. But he still remembered Zhang Chan's instructions that the most important thing was to have a stable state of mind, so after only half a day, he was no longer in the mood to cultivate. He was either playing with the civet cat or dozing off lazily. This repeated for a few days before a steward came to report that his disciple, Gohan, had come to pay a visit. Meng who was bored alone, so he said, "Call him in." After a while, Gohan walked into the inner residence with a jade plate in his hand. When he saw Meng who sitting there with a serious look on his face, he bowed and said, "Disciple greets teacher." Meng who looked at the jade plate in his hand and was instantly interested. He asked, "What did you bring?" Gohan said, "Teacher is here, how can disciple not show respect? These are some precious treasures to express my sincerity, and—" He took out a book and handed it over. He said respectfully, "Teacher, this is the Taoist work that disciple has done all these years. I hope that teacher can guide me." Most of the things recorded in the book were the supernatural powers and art of transformation that he had created all these years. Meng who took it and casually flipped through it twice. He used his mana to make some changes on it and threw it back. Gohan took it back and looked at it. He could not help but be convinced. Teacher was teacher after all. His vision was still too narrow. All these years, he had been studying the art of transformation, but most of it was used for personal fun. He did not expect that it could be used to deal with all kinds of opponents. For example, to suggest that he sneak into the Luo sect and transform himself into the statue of the demon god of the Luo sect. He would be worshipped by people every day. Then he could casually issue orders and order people to work for him. Although he would be exposed if he was not careful, the excitement in it made him excited just thinking about it. There were still a lot of comments at the back. He decided to take it back and read it slowly. He carefully kept it and said, "Teacher, Teacher Duan and Teacher Shi are also in the branch altar now. They want to meet you, but when they came yesterday, they heard that you were meditating, so they retreated. They are now waiting outside to meet you. I wonder if it is convenient for you?" Meng who said straightforwardly, "There is no inconvenience. Just call them in." After he gave the order, not long after, Duan Yi and Priest Shi walked into the inner residence. They came up and bowed solemnly, "Greetings, great guardian." Gohan said, "Teacher, the two teachers can be considered as people of Yen sect now." Duan Yi and Priest Shi quickly nodded. However, it was not without a price for them to join Yen sect. They were forced to swear that they would not teach the Tao of the spirit of creation. Their disciples were also the same. The path of teaching had already been cut off. Priest Shi said, "Great Guardian Meng, if there is anything you need, just tell us to do it. We have just joined the sect and hope to contribute to the sect." Meng who was about to say something when he suddenly felt something. He did not say a word and hurriedly left the seat and entered the back residence. He left a few people looking at each other. Meng who came to an empty hall at the back and saw Zhang Chan standing there. He quickly went forward and bowed. "Teacher, why are you here?" Zhang Chan looked at him and said, "Zhou Huanyuan Jade's entry into the human realm is not a small matter. I am also here to take a look. Who knows, I might have a use for you and your comrades." He came here this time because he was taken care of by Zhang Yan's double. In fact, the Tao incarnation in Meng whose state of mind was right. The spirit of creation and the primordial jade formed from the essence of creation came from the same place. Therefore, the two were naturally attracted to each other. Right now, almost all the people gathered at Meng whose place were related to the spirit of creation. He and Gohan were the reincarnations of the spirit of creation, while Duan and Shi, as well as their disciples, were also cultivating the spirit of creation's Tao techniques. The only difference was that these people insisted on their own Tao and did not yield to the Tao. However, they still had a foothold. Therefore, there was no harm in using this power to find it. If they could really attract the primordial jade, then they could save a lot of effort later on. At the same time, in the Yen sect's main altar, people were also paying close attention to the changes in the mirror division. The primordial jade's entry into the human realm was no longer a secret. Some of the Taoists in the universe were blessed by the heavens and sensed it in advance. Therefore, they informed the sect. There were also people who knew the future for no reason and spread the news in order to fish in troubled waters. There were even people who received pointers from powerful people in their dreams. These people were all rushing to the Mirror Lake. However, no matter who it was, they had to use the realm gate of the Yen sect. Therefore, almost everyone's chi activity would be copied by the Yen sect. In addition, the Yen sect's influence here was relatively large. They occupied an incomparably huge advantage right from the start. The Yen sect's only flaw was that there were too few powerful people in the upper levels. They were obviously unable to compete with the Taoists in the universe. Those worshippers were fine on normal days, but they were obviously unreliable now. The Yen sect did not dare to trust them. This was because the more profound a person's cultivation was, the more likely they would be interested in the Zhou Huanyuan jade. Therefore, someone suggested to simply close the realm gate and cut off the communication between the two regions. This way, the Yen sect could fight for the primordial jade behind closed doors. If they obtained this item, the Yen sect could use it to make a breakthrough. However, the sect master Gao Chengtu immediately rejected this suggestion. If the Yen sect dared to do so, then they would be making it clear that they were the enemy of the Taoists in the universe. The many divisions of Bu Su heaven would definitely be destroyed. Moreover, he was very clear that the Yen sect could participate in the fight this time. However, even if they obtained this item, they might not be able to decide who it belonged to. The attitude of the powerful people in the upper realms was the most crucial. In the Xiantian heaven beyond the Mirror Lake, Lu Lin, Chen Chan, Emotsang, Han Shao, and old ancestor Huantong were the 5 people. Yuan Zun was sitting there. Ever since Zhang Yan resurrected these 5 people, the entire Mirror Lake was under their control. Their main role was to keep the heavens in peace and to guard against the infiltration of the deviant races and various heretic teachings. Old ancestor Emotsang held a palm leaf fan and slowly fanned himself. He said, "The primordial jade is about to arrive. Not only are the Taoists of various sects gathering here, but the deviant races are also coming one after another. It's really lively here." Exalted Han Zhao's expression was cold. She said, "This item is hard to come by. In the past, we have paid a great price and waited for countless reincarnations. Just now, we have succeeded. As a Taoist cultivator, even if there's only a sliver of possibility, we won't let it go easily." Her words made everyone present think about how hard it was for them to search for this item in the past. They all sighed with emotion. Lu Lin said in a deep voice, "No matter who gets the primordial jade, it can only fall into the hands of the cultivators of the human Tao. It can't be taken away by the deviant races." Since Zhou Huanyuan jade had entered the human realm, it was impossible for Bai Wei, Deng Zhang, Qi Yao, and the other demon masters to remain silent. Recently, they had been constantly sending their disciples over to fight for the primordial jade. If the primordial jade fell into their hands, it was highly possible that one of the deviant races would be resurrected. Old ancestor Emotsang chuckled and said, "Taoist friend, you can rest assured this time. This place is where the mysterious mirror world is located. Our old opponents won't be able to come here." Old ancestor Huantong stroked his beard and said, "We can't interfere with the primordial jade either. We have to rely on the juniors to fight for it. Moreover, the supreme fixed law allows them to fight for it in order to stir up the karma. Therefore, we can't be too careless. If it is really taken away by the deviant races, it would really be a joke. We would also fail the supreme fixed law." Old ancestor Emotsang nodded. He thought for a while and said, "However, apart from guarding against those deviant races, I think we also have to be careful of those who believe in the Tao of creation. I feel that this generation seems to be innately connected with the heavenly fate. If one of them obtains it, he might be able to cross the barrier and enter the true Yang realm in an instant. Therefore, we have to be extra careful." Chapter 2267. Although Zhang Yan was in Qinghuan Palace, he could clearly hear the conversation between old ancestor Huantong and the other 4. He didn't deliberately listen, but as long as he willed it, anything he wanted to know in the current world would be reflected in his heart in an instant. Old ancestor Emotsang was worried that after those spirits of creation found the Zhou Huanyuan jade, they would be able to immediately cross the threshold of true Yang. This wasn't an exaggeration, but he had actually underestimated this generation. Especially under the influence of the spirit of creation Weili, if this generation really obtained the primordial jade, then under the influence of the Weili, it wouldn't be difficult for them to directly enter the spirit refinement realm in a day. This was because the threshold of any realm didn't exist for them. It was only because of the stumbling block of the primordial jade that they couldn't soar to the sky in one go. Of course, the premise was that the spirits of creation had to completely submit to the Tao. However, among the 10% of sentient beings, how many of them would be willing to abandon themselves? Even those who submitted to the Tao might not have the thought of first using the Tao to ascend to the upper realm, then finding an opportunity to turn the tables. Therefore, for people like Meng Hu who had lived in the Yen sect for a long time, if they weren't pushed by some irresistible force, they wouldn't abandon themselves and turn to dedicate themselves to the Tao. However, if they really fell into the hands of those who purely worshipped the Tao, then even if they had to kill the owner of fate and stop the primordial jade from entering the world, they wouldn't give the spirit of creation Wei any chance. After all, the spirits of creation were the enemies of all great virtue, so they couldn't ignore the small details. Therefore, if they could be stopped, they couldn't let them have the chance to grow. It was best to cut them off from the source. In the Yen sect's headquarters, Gao Qingtu received a report. Recently, many altars discovered that due to the influence of the inscription, even if the Yen sect didn't stop killing, the spirit of creation's Tao was still spreading uncontrollably. After pondering deeply, he ordered someone to summon Tang Yu and solemnly instructed, "Recently, you need to keep an eye on all the people who worship the spirit of creation's Tao. If there's any unusual movement, you can deal with them at your discretion." Tang Yu asked, "Is teacher suspecting that Yuan Yu will choose the fated one among them?" Gao Qingtu shook his head and said, "The fated person might not be the true master of fate. Until the very last moment, no one knows who will obtain the origin jade. You, me, or even anyone else could obtain it. However, the cultivators who have obtained the spirit of creation Tao technique undoubtedly have the highest possibility of obtaining the origin jade." Tang Yu said, "Then this disciple will hurry to the mystic mirror division." Because of the matter of Yuan Yu entering the world, the cult had already decided that when the time came, the mysterious mirror branch altar would be overseen by him. It was just that the time had not come yet, so he had not been able to set off. Gao Qingtu shook his head and said, "Whether it's the Da order, the Luo order, or the other sects, or the believers of the spirit of creation, all of them see my Yen order as their enemy. Now, there are still cultivators from all over the heavens rushing over. That place is now a quagmire. It's hard to say what will happen. If you go now, you'll fall into it instead. Let's wait for a while more. I expect that if there's an unforeseen event, it will be in the near future." In the past, the relationship between the Yen order's mysterious mirror branch altar and the main altar was only nominal. However, the main altar continuously transferred the remaining people from the other branches over, and also transferred some of the people who held authority here to foreign lands. Not to say that this place was completely under the rule of the main altar, but it was also no longer outwardly obedient but inwardly opposed like before. The current branch altar master, Luo Juan, was transferred here from another place 10 years ago. This person's ability was passable, and he was qualified to manage this place. However, as the UNU entered the world, the cultivators from all over the heavens also swarmed here, and there were endless conflicts with the Yen order. Almost at every moment, there would be urgent reports coming. Every day, he was so busy that he didn't even have the time to sit still and adjust his breathing. On this day, he dealt with another part of the affairs, and finally had some spare time. After circulating his technique, he felt that his cultivation was lacking, so he immediately sat down and entered the monastery. However, just now, when he raised his qi dynamic, a Tao technique suddenly appeared in his mind. After looking at it for a while, he realized that it was the spirit of creation Tao technique, and he couldn't help but be shocked. Within the mysterious mirror branch altar, as there were many sects mixed together, and many cultivators were difficult to distinguish, there were many people spreading the spirit of creation Tao technique everywhere. After the Yen order captured this person, if it was someone who had cultivated to a high level and had a strong background, it would not be easy to directly deal with him. Thus, he, the person with the highest cultivation in the branch altar, had to personally erase this person's memory. However, in the process, he couldn't help but see some things. Fortunately, he wasn't a person with a weak Tao heart, and he would always erase these thoughts every time. He originally thought that these past memories had been completely erased, but now, for some unknown reason, they suddenly appeared all of a sudden. From the looks of it, in reality, he didn't completely erase them, but they were only suppressed in the deepest part and settled there. Now, they were affected by external forces, so they surged up again. At this moment, he was trying his best to stay true to his heart, rejecting these Tao techniques, and struggling with difficulty. However, he realized that the more he struggled, the deeper he sank. It was as if he was contaminated with some filth, and when he stirred it, it would speed up the mixing of them together. The key was that those principles were all correct, and this was even more terrifying. There was no doubt that this was extremely attractive to cultivators, and even he felt that it was gradually becoming difficult to resist. He realized that he couldn't go on like this, or else he would definitely not be able to withstand it. If he wanted to get rid of these, he could only erase this part of his memory. Moreover, in order to do it thoroughly, he could form a doppelganger and send all the memories about Tao techniques into it, and then kill it. Even if doing so would sacrifice a part of his cultivation, it was worth it. At worst, he could find a way to cultivate it back in the future. Having made up his mind, he immediately tried to form a doppelganger. Altar Master, Altar Master? Luo Juan suddenly came to his senses, and saw that it was an attendant disciple standing there, calling out to him in a low voice. He was a little displeased that he was disturbed, and asked in a low voice, "What's the matter?" The attendant disciple carefully looked at his expression, and braced himself to place the rather tall stack of memorials on the table, saying, "Altar Master, this is today's memorial, please take a look." Luo Juan was startled, and he glanced outside, asking, "What time is it?" The attendant disciple replied, "It's morning." Luo Juan was shocked. In fact, he didn't need the attendant disciple to say more. He could also feel that the current time had changed, and that an entire night had passed since yesterday. But he didn't have the slightest impression of this night, which was extremely abnormal. Now, he couldn't be sure whether this was because he had killed the doppelganger's memories and resolved the matter, or because he had been infected by that Tao technique, causing his mind to be confused. He tried to circulate his cultivation method, and there was no loss in his qi dynamic. It seemed that nothing had happened, but this made him increasingly feel that something was wrong. Seeing that he didn't respond for a long time, the attendant disciple called out to him again. Just now Luo Juan had come to his senses, and he put this matter aside, preparing to resolve it later. His gaze swept over, and he first read all the memorials, but a trace of surprise emerged in his expression. You found a fated person this time?" The attendant disciple said, "Yes, this is also luck. His parents were originally followers of my Yen sect, so they quite approve of my Yen sect. Now, almost every force was fighting for the fated person who might draw the Yuan Jade. The Yen sect knew that a tall tree would attract the wind, and the imperial edict also ordered them not to be meddlesome. They only had to be wary of outsiders who would harm the sect, so they had been avoiding fighting for it. But they didn't expect that there would actually be someone who took the initiative to come to their door." Luo Juan said, "I understand. First, take good care of him and don't disturb him." These fated people were all voluntary. If you forced him, or if he made you feel threatened, then the Yuan Jade would likely not choose him again. The attendant disciple said, "This subordinate will understand." Luo Juan waved his hand, and let the attendant disciple retreat. He sat on the praying mat and thought about it seriously. He still felt that something must have gone wrong last night, so he sank his mind and investigated internally. However, unknowingly, he fell into a meditative state where he couldn't feel anything outside. After a while, a trace of black gas appeared behind him, and then another Luo Juan walked out. This person smiled at him sitting there, and walked out of the mansion unhurriedly. When the attendant disciple waiting outside saw him come out, he said, "Altar Master, do you have any instructions?" Luo Juan said, "Take me to see the fated person." The attendant disciple said yes and led the way in front. Not long after, they came to a garden with pleasant scenery. There was a hut here, and a little boy with strong limbs and a rough face was shooting an eagle in front of the hut. He seemed to be having a good time. Luo Juan glanced at him from afar, and his eyes flashed. No one knew what he was thinking. Then he left after saying, "Take good care of him." Outside, he waved to the attendant disciple. The latter came up and bowed, saying, "Altar Master, do you have any other instructions?" Luo Juan said, "How is Guardian Meng now?" The attendant disciple said, "He has been staying in his original cave residence and never goes out. He only meditates and adjusts his breathing. Recently, there have only been a few visitors." Luo Juan nodded, saying, "Recently, my Yin Jiao has to face many opponents. I have a formula here that can improve magical power. You can pass it down and let the people under you know." As he spoke, he stretched out his hand, and a talisman appeared. The attendant disciple took it, hesitated, and said, "Do you want the guardians to take a look?" According to the rules of the Yanjiao, matters involving passing down spells and battles were the responsibility of the guardians. If the altar master did not discuss this with the guardians in advance, then even if he passed it down, they had the right to abolish it. Luo Juan said, "No problem. I will personally discuss this matter with the guardians. You can go and make the arrangements first." The attendant disciple did not dare to disobey and agreed. Just now, after taking 2 steps, he suddenly thought of something and carefully asked, "Altar Master, this formula, should we also send it to Guardian Meng?" Luo Juan's eyes were deep. He smiled, saying, "Guardian Meng and his disciples are also people of my Yanjiao. How can we favor one and discriminate against the others? Send them a copy too." Chapter 2268. Meng Hu followed Zhang Chan's instructions and summoned Gohan, Duan, and Shi, as well as their disciples, to his side. With so many cultivators who practiced the Tao of the spirit of creation gathered in one place, the possibility of attracting Yuan Yu's attention was greatly increased. He had a special position in the subaltar. As the great guardian of the Kuan Shi subaltar, he did not have a master-servant relationship with the altar master, but only listened to the orders of the headquarters. There were many people like him, and the altar master could not order them around. Therefore, if he did not take the initiative to cause trouble, no one would come to disturb him. Everyone thought that they could continue waiting until Yuan Yu officially selected a fated person. Then, the matter here would be settled. Unexpectedly, the deacon in charge of transportation, Meng Hu, rushed over and handed him a jade scroll. He said, "Great Guardian Meng, this is the martial arts manual sent by Altar Master Luo. It is said that it can improve one's supernatural power. Great Guardian, why don't you take a look?" Meng Hu pondered for a moment. He seemed to have met that Altar Lord Luo a few days ago, but he no longer had any impression of him. He took the divine ability and Dharma art and took a few glances at it before losing interest. He yawned and threw it to Gohan. Gohan looked at it and was a little stunned. He felt that there was something wrong with this martial arts manual, but he could not tell. Moreover, he had been thinking about how to sneak into the Luo sect and disguise as the devil god. Therefore, he did not have the mood to investigate and handed it to Duan and Shi. "Teachers, please take a look." Duan and Shi, on the other hand, were much more sensitive. When they looked down, they also felt a sense of unnaturalness. They felt that there was something wrong here. They did not dare to try something with uncertain effects. Moreover, they had their own martial arts and thought that they were on the right path, so they did not need to be distracted to cultivate such things. The deacon saw that he had no doubt about the cultivation method, so he excused himself. He then took out a talisman, wrote a few words, and sent the talisman. After Luo Juan gave the instructions, he reminded the disciple that as long as he did not take the initiative to mention the supernatural power, the disciple should not mention anything about it in front of him. Although the attendant disciple found it strange, Luo Juan had never explained the specific reasons for his actions in the past, so he quickly agreed. Luo Juan circled around outside before returning to the inner mansion. He then walked straight to the body that was still meditating and instantly fused with it. After a while, he woke up again, but he had no idea what he was doing just now. However, his cultivation was not weak after all, and he felt as if he had forgotten something. However, just now, he could not find any problems in his meditative state. It was not appropriate for him to continue being entangled like this. He still had to deal with the matters on the memorial one by one, and he could not spend too much time on cultivation. He sighed to himself and said, "I wonder when Elder Tang from the main altar will arrive. His skills are profound. If he's here, I can ask him for guidance." He shook his head and dealt with all the matters in the main altar first. After that, he drove the flying vessel out to inspect the various altars in the Dark Mirror world. Due to the recent competition between the various sects for the fated person, these altars had summoned back the followers scattered outside. However, this did not mean that there was nothing to worry about. Due to the threat from the outside, all the altars were in turmoil, so he had to show up from time to calm the people. If he did not do so, it was likely that there would be problems. After working hard for a few days, he suddenly felt a little tired and frowned. As a cultivator, no matter how hard he worked, he would at most exhaust some of his mental energy. However, there must be something wrong with the current situation. He thought of the previous night, and his mood became even more gloomy. When he returned to the sect, he immediately went into seclusion to adjust his breath. However, just now did not sit for long before he fell into a meditative state. The figure behind him appeared again. He was not in a hurry to do anything, but waited here for half a day before he went outside and said, "Come in." The attendant disciple hurried over and said, "Altar Master, what orders do you have?" Luo Juan said, "Have you prepared the things I asked you to do?" The attendant disciple said, "The name list that Altar Master needs is here, please take a look." As he said that, he took out a book from his sleeve and handed it over. Luo Juan took it and flipped through it. The purpose of passing down this method was to identify those who hid in the subaltars and secretly cultivated the Tao of the Spirit of Creation. Any cultivator who cultivated the Tao of the Spirit of Tao would not be interested in this supernatural power that he passed down, and they would even disdain it. Ordinary people were not in this category. Therefore, even if the guardians in the subaltars saw these incantations, they would not be able to find any problems, and no one would come forward to stop him. When he finished reading, he found that there were more than 500 people in the subaltars who did not cultivate this method. The number was far beyond his previous expectations. However, there were some amongst them that were unable to comprehend this technique because their natural talent was too inferior, and there were also some that were busy with mundane affairs and didn't have the time to cultivate it. After all of these were eliminated, it was extremely likely that the last few that remained were those that were hiding here and believed in the spirit of creation or disciples that were suitable to cultivate this Tao art. At this moment he revealed a strange expression because he noticed that no one gathered at Meng whose place had practiced this method. This was definitely not a coincidence. He thought to himself, "This is interesting." However, he did not do anything immediately, but returned to Luo Juan's body. In the next few months, every time Luo Juan went into seclusion, he would inevitably appear, and the time he stayed was getting longer and longer. Until one day, Luo Juan's own consciousness unknowingly sank into the deepest part of his mind, and the figure had completely occupied his body. Luo Juan walked out of his seclusion, calculated, and smiled deeply. He went to Meng Hu's place. When the deacon guarding in front of Meng Hu's door saw him, he was shocked. "Altar leader?" Luo Juan nodded and strode inside. Seeing that there was no one in the main hall, he went straight to the back residence. At this time, Meng Hu was dozing off, and Gohan, Duan, and Shi were discussing Tao at the side. The deacon hurriedly went up and said, "Great Guardian, wake up, altar leader Luo is here." Meng Hu raised his head and asked doubtfully, "Which altar leader Luo?" The deacon showed a bit of embarrassment and said, "Of course it's altar leader Luo of the mysterious mirror subaltars." "Great Guardian, have you forgotten that altar leader came to visit Great Guardian the day before yesterday?" Meng Hu glanced at Luo Juan and muttered to himself, "Why does it seem like someone else has changed?" Luo Juan's eyes flickered, and he said in a deep voice, "Fellow Taoist Meng has a keen eye, I'm impressed. It's not wrong to say that I'm not Luo Juan." He waved his hand, and the deacon suddenly became dazed. He turned around and walked out involuntarily. Then, he looked at Meng Hu and said, "Fellow Taoist must be practicing the spirit of creation Tao technique?" Meng Hu said, "Yes." Luo Juan was very satisfied and said, "Very well, since fellow Taoist has admitted it, then let's talk openly and honestly. I'm sure fellow Taoist knows that only the spirit of creation Tao technique can attract Zhou Huanyuan Jade. If you and I work together," he pointed to Gohan and the others, "together with the disciples and followers around fellow Taoist, there's a high chance that we'll attract this thing." Meng Hu agreed readily, "Sure." Luo Juan's face lit up and he said, "Fellow Taoist is indeed a wise person, but fellow Taoist prioritizes his own Tao, which won't attract Yuanyuan Jade. Therefore, I'll have to trouble everyone and temporarily submit to the Tao technique." "Change the Tao technique?" Duan Ye's eyes widened, and he said in disbelief, "How can we do that? The Tao technique needs to follow one's heart. How can it be changed so easily?" Luo Juan, however, said leisurely, "This isn't difficult. As long as you retract the Tao in your heart and stop interfering with your own body, the Tao technique will naturally have the upper hand. Yuanyuan Jade isn't a living creature, so it won't be able to distinguish these things. Of course, if you're not willing, I can also help you wait a while." His tone was full of undisguised malice. Gohan, Duan Yi, and Shi Yi could see that something was wrong, and they unconsciously took a few steps back. Meng Hu rubbed his chin and said, "It seems that your path is wrong." Luo Juan smiled and said, "No, there's nothing wrong. I'm walking the right path." He was the incarnation of the spirit of creation Tao technique and was born from Luo Juan's heart. He was merely contaminated with a trace of Luo Juan's personality. At this moment, he glanced at them and said, "Everyone, since you're hesitating, let me give you a hand." As he spoke, he waved his sleeves, and boundless supernatural power pressed down. He was confident that his cultivation was the highest here. Regardless of whether these people cooperated or not, he could still twist their consciousness and turn them into his puppets. Then, he could use this generation to bring more cultivators who worshipped the spirit of creation Tao technique under his command. This way, his chances of seizing the Yuanyuan Jade would increase greatly. However, as soon as he made his move, he realized that something was wrong. Meng Hu was just standing there, and his supernatural power was completely blocked by him. Unconsciously, his eyes narrowed. He had originally thought that Meng Hu was at most at the Grotto Heaven realm, but now it seemed that Meng Hu's cultivation was no weaker than his. He couldn't help but feel that he had miscalculated. If he had known this would happen, he would have waited a little longer. Maybe Meng Hu would have agreed. Although he was in trouble now, he could only be tough to the end. But just now Luo Juan was thinking this, he saw countless golden bugs appearing out of thin air and rushing toward him. He hurriedly blew out a breath, intending to blow these bugs away. However, in the next moment, his expression changed. These golden bugs were actually not living creatures, but tiny ritual implements. However, when he used his divine will to calculate them, he couldn't see through them. He immediately knew that there must be someone more powerful here to be able to hide from his senses. If Meng Hu was added to the mix, it would be difficult to achieve his goal this time. He was also decisive. Once he saw that the situation wasn't right, he didn't continue fighting. Instead, he directly shifted and left this place. However, he hadn't gone far when he suddenly felt that his body was heavy. When he turned around to look, he was horrified. There was a golden bug that was half the size of a human lying on his back. Its hooked claws had already sunk deep into his dharmakaya, but he didn't feel anything strange. He immediately tried to shift. However, although his consciousness could still move, the chi activity and supernatural power in his body were already out of control, and he couldn't help but freeze there. A golden light flashed, and Zhang Chan had already appeared in the middle of the sky. He gathered his supernatural power and grabbed the bug. He chuckled and said, "Kid, why did you leave so quickly? I still need your help in the matter of the Yuanyuan Jade." Chapter 2269. When Zhang Chan returned to the subaltar with Luo Juan, Tang Yu was already there. Seeing the former coming over, he cupped his hands and said, "Master Zhang, thank you for your trouble." Zhang Chan directly threw the unconscious Luo Juan to the ground and said, "The Yuanyu has fallen into his hands." Tang Yu said, Master Zhang is very capable to be able to capture him so quickly. He was ordered by Gao Qingtu to assist Zhang Quan, but he did not expect that Zhang Quan had already finished his task by the time he arrived. Luo Juan was the altar master of the mysterious mirror subaltar. Now that this subaltar was at the same level as the Kunsher subaltar, his cultivation was not weak. Zhang Quan snorted and said, All these years, I have been deducing with fellow Taoists how to deal with the Tao of the spirit of creation. I know exactly what this person can do. Tang Yu pondered for a moment and said, We came in a hurry, so the hierarch did not explain the specific situation to me. I heard that if the destined person has the heart to resist, the UNU will not be attracted to him. Now that fellow Taoist has captured Luo Juan, if he is unwilling or opposes me, how can the UNU be attracted? He suspected that what happened to Luo Juan might not be a coincidence, but that the hierarch had long expected it, which was why he and Zhang Quan had acted one after another. But he was very wise not to ask too much. Since Gao Qingtu did not say anything, it was obvious that he had his own considerations. Sometimes, it was not that he did not trust you, but that some things would make things worse if you knew about them. Zhang Quan said, That is different. The situation that fellow Taoist is talking about is that if the UNU encounters a person who is resistant or has a weak will, it will not fall into that person's hands. But the premise is that it is human. He pointed to Luo Juan. Although this person is still human, his body is the incarnation of the Tao of the spirit of creation. The exterior is not the human thoughts, but the appearance of the human thoughts. The interior is like the original Tao, cold and emotionless, which is the best sustenance for the UNU. Because Luo Juan was the incarnation of the Taoist law, he could continuously draw in the great power that seeped in, and he could even use it to solve the great power that was wreaking havoc everywhere. Of course, the Taoist law was still weak. Even if the great power of the spirit of creation was weakened by 99% by Zhang Yan, he could not absorb much by himself. But it was certain that the stronger the Tao, the greater the possibility of attracting the UNU. Tang Yu asked, Fellow Taoist, there is no harm in trying. Zhang Quan said nonchalantly, The mysteries of heaven are unpredictable. Let's do our best and leave it to fate. There's no harm in trying. Tang Yu nodded, That's true. Zhang Quan said, But fellow Taoist Tang, you have to be careful when guarding this Taoist technique incarnation. Right now, he's only being suppressed by my talisman, but as more power is drawn in, he'll continue to grow stronger. You have to be careful here. If he's too small, he might not be able to attract the origin jade, but if he's too big, I'm afraid it'll be difficult to suppress him. Tang Yu thought for a while, then said, I have a plan. If they were prepared for this in advance, it wouldn't be a problem. Without the origin jade, the person would not be able to cross the threshold of the realm. No matter how much he struggled, he would only be limited to the mortal metamorphosis level. No matter how high his magic power was, it would not be too high. As long as it was arranged in a prepared formation, there would not be any problems. However, Zhang Chan's reminder woke him up a little. After all, he was not facing the cultivator himself, but the incarnation of a Taoist technique. It might be difficult to predict the situation. He looked at Luo Juan again and asked, Honorable Zhang, since Luo Juan's body is occupied by a Taoist incarnation, how is he? Can he still be saved? Zhang Quan said, If his consciousness is completely obliterated, the incarnation of a Taoist technique will have no place to reside. Therefore, it should be temporarily suppressed to the lowest level of his mind. When the incarnation of a Taoist technique is destroyed, it can be restored. However, for him, it will depend on his own will. If his mind is not strong enough, he will not be able to find himself again. Tang Yu said in a low voice, So, he can only rely on himself to survive this tribulation? Zhang Quan said, That's right, exactly so. Tang Yu nodded with a sullen face. There were not many cultivators who could reach the mortal metamorphosis level in the upper echelons of the sect of Yen. Losing even one would be a great loss. Moreover, even though Luo Juan's ability could only be considered average, he was very responsible in his work. What was more rare was that he did not have any selfish thoughts. Tang Yu also did not wish for his life to be taken away like this. At this moment, Zhang Chan called Meng Hu over and said with concern, "Boy, go and keep an eye on those cultivators who cultivate in the Taoist technique of the spirit of creation. Regardless of whether the origin jade has chosen you or not, come down and circulate your techniques. Don't stop until I tell you to." Meng Hu lowered his head and said, "Yes, teacher." Tang Yu saw that Meng Hu's behavior was very different from what he had seen in the past. He found it a little strange, but he did not know that in front of Zhang Chan, Meng Hu had always been very obedient. After Meng Hu left, he cupped his hands and said, "High Official Zhang, thank you very much for this time. There are still some matters that I need to trouble you with." Zhang Chan laughed and said, "You're wrong. This is your sect of Yan's matter. I'm only responsible for what I need to do, and these matters have already been completed. The rest has nothing to do with me." Tang Yu was startled, but he immediately nodded. Even without Zhang Chan, relying purely on the power of sect of Yan's own strength could still ensure that there was no worry. He had always been swift and decisive in his actions, so he said at once, "Then I won't disturb High Official Zhang." When he finished, he turned around and left, hurrying to arrange matters. Kuai He was currently residing in a hidden cave residence. In the previous battle of the Nameless Realm, he had withdrawn from the battle early, and in the end he was lucky enough to escape. However, the other people who went with him were all trapped inside. It should be known that these people were not forcefully promoted by the Almighty with mana, but purely relied on their own natural endowments to cultivate. Moreover, every person's cultivation time was far shorter than their peers, and could be said to be unparalleled in natural endowments. Therefore, to the innate demons and extraterrestrial demons, the loss was not small. A silhouette flashed outside, and an illusory figure walked in. It was an extraterrestrial heavenly demon, the only disciple sent by the 6 demon masters this time. His name was Luo Zhan, and behind him was a young man with eyes filled with curiosity. Kuai He glanced at the young man, and his spirit transmitted, "Fated person?" Luo Zhan raised his head, and with his sleeves behind his back, he said, "Of course, how can I return empty-handed?" It was just that although he felt that he had displayed his own temperament, Kuai He cultivated the ruthless Tao. No matter how he behaved, Kuai He's expression did not change. This made him feel a little unhappy, but he could not say it out loud. He could only snort to show his dissatisfaction. Kuai He said, "Leave this child to me. Did Taoist friend cause any trouble?" Now, the competition between the sects for the fated person was very intense. They had already found a fated person before, and now they found another one. He did not believe that there would be no trouble at all. Luo Zhan said proudly, "Don't worry, I won't leave any loose ends when I do things." As an extraterrestrial demon, his strength was secondary, but he was most proficient in bewitching people's hearts. This was very convenient when dealing with the fated person, and he did not need to force them to follow him obediently. Even if many almighty people could forcefully change the state of mind or create illusions, but under the interference of mana, the UNU would not necessarily come again. He, on the other hand, could influence the people around the fated person to gain their trust. This was very clever. To have 2 fated people in their hands was already a great fortune, and they were already very satisfied. If they wanted to find more fated people, it would undoubtedly attract more people to target them. However, this did not mean that their actions ended here. Next, they still had another matter to do, and this matter was even more important. Luo Zhan would find a way to stir the minds of the fated people in the hands of other forces and cause them to resist. This way, the UNU would automatically avoid this generation, and the fated people in their hands would have a higher chance of obtaining the UNU. After Luo Zhan regulated his breathing for half a day, he left his hiding place and fled to a boundary where his clones were stationed. Along the way, he frequently saw the spell altars of the Da Order, the Luo Order, and even the Yen Order, but he turned a blind eye to them. These few sects obviously had a strong background behind them. If it was in Bu Su heaven, he would still have some confidence, but the 6 demon masters clearly told him that mysterious mirror heaven was very special. Their mana could not reach here, so he could only rely on himself. He remembered this point, and naturally did not dare to go and provoke them. Not to mention these, every sect was now in closed-door seclusion. Even if he had any plans in his heart, it was impossible to pass through the forbidden formation quietly. So now he could only make a move on those forces that did not have much of a background. Half a day later, he came to the hiding place of his clones. This was a spacious underground cave, and around it sat a dozen or so cultivators. Among them, the person with the highest cultivation had also cut off his past and future body. There were formation flags outside, but they were more useful as a warning than a defense. At this moment, everyone was trying their best to restrain their aura, because there was a silly, strong man in the middle who did not have much cultivation. Muo Zhan swept a few glances, and with a thought, he withdrew his clones. At the same time, all the people and things that the clones had seen before were clearly reflected in his divine will. He sneered, and ignored the formation outside. With a thought, he disappeared from where he was, and walked out from one of the bodies. Then, he directly pointed at the strong man, and an indescribable thing had already attached itself to him. The cultivator with the highest cultivation frowned at this moment, as if he felt that something was wrong. However, the method used by Muo Zhan was very covert, and cultivators who had not come into contact with the extraterrestrial demons would not be able to detect anything. Moreover, he had only laid a trap in advance, and it did not involve the life of the strong man. If he did not trigger it, it would be very difficult to detect. Only when the Yuan Yu was about to find its fated owner would this method suddenly be activated. At that time, even if he wanted to stop it, it would be too late. After doing this, Muo Zhan glanced at the few people contemptuously and moved out of this place to search for his next target. In just a few months, he had consecutively left a trap in more than a dozen forces. In fact, at this moment, there were already people vaguely aware of his actions, but as long as he did not get himself into trouble, these people were even happy to see this happen. Muo Zhan wandered for another 10 days, and seeing that he could not find any more suitable targets, and judging from his premonition, it was about time for the Yuan Yu to enter the world, so he returned to the cave where he was hiding. At this time, the various forces no longer participated in the battle, and each returned to their hiding places to wait patiently, only waiting to see which side the Yuan Yu would fall into. Chapter 2270. Half a year passed in the blink of an eye. In the mysterious mirror sky, the various forces all simultaneously fortified their own formations and tried their best to protect the fated people around them. This time, there were no powerhouses from the various sects who had made an agreement beforehand, so the person who obtained the Yuan Jade was likely to be coveted by the various sects, and it was also possible for it to be taken away. Although after the Yuan Jade entered the world, without the consent of the fated owner, no one could take it away, but as long as the fated owner was snatched, there were ways to make them submit. However, the most troublesome thing was not to protect this item, but to smoothly return. Because if you wanted to return, you would have to pass through the Yen sect realm gate. At this time, if the Yen sect did something, then this item might not be able to be kept. Therefore, those who were knowledgeable would have long found a place to stay in mysterious mirror sky and set up a formation. This way, once they obtained the Yuan Jade, they could immediately use it and not be afraid of it being taken away. However, this also had a great hidden danger. To refine it to the true Yang realm, it could be said to take a long time, and during this period, they would need to constantly swallow Ziqing great medicine to maintain their body in the world. If their seclusion place was attacked, then it was very likely that they would be forced to stop cultivating, and then they would miss the opportunity to ascend to the upper realm. In the cave, Kuai He and Zhuozhan sat there. Kuai He sensed for a while and thought that the Yuan Jade would appear soon, so he asked, "Taoist, when will you act?" Zhuozhan said, "No rush, now is not the time. If we act too early, once we are discovered, they will definitely find us here. Let's wait a little longer." Kuai He said in a low voice, "The formation flags here were bestowed by my master, and are enough to protect us. Taoist, you don't have to worry so much." Zhuozhan glanced at him and said, "Since Taoist has said so, what do I have to worry about?" Otherwise, it would seem that I am afraid. He did not hesitate anymore and immediately took out a technique. However, after a while, the response that came made him startled. More than half of the methods that he secretly laid down were blocked and dissolved by others. Obviously, these people were not good people and had all sensed something. The reason why they did not act earlier was because they were afraid that he would use another method, so they simply ignored him and waited for him to act just now to break it. He also felt that it was a pity. He felt that he had underestimated his peers. However, it was better than nothing. However, he was too full of himself earlier, and this matter had undoubtedly caused him to lose face. Thus, he didn't reveal the truth and only coughed before saying as if nothing had happened, "The Tao technique has already been used, but the laws of fate are determined by the heavens. It might not fall into our hands, so fellow Taoists shouldn't have too much hope." In the Xian mirror branch altar, Tang Yu stood on the altar with a solemn expression. Behind him were the guardians and deacons of the branch altar. Zhang Chan was also standing at the side. However, compared to everyone else, he seemed to be more relaxed. In the center of the altar, Luo Juan sat there. There was a black gas floating around his body that no one could see, drawing the Wei Li toward him and gathering them together. Although no one could feel this power, it was not difficult to see that his aura was constantly rising, and the altar was trembling slightly. Obviously, there was a huge external force that continued to pour in. After an unknown period of time, an inexplicable feeling suddenly appeared in everyone's hearts. It was as if there was a pull in the dark. Everyone couldn't help but look up into the sky, and they saw that in the sky above the altar, a profound stone that seemed to be able to penetrate the void and absorb light suddenly appeared from the void. Everyone stared blankly for a long time before someone reacted and said with joy, "Elder Tang, it's Yuan Yu, it's Yuan Yu." Tang Yu's expression did not show any surprise, but became particularly solemn. He took care of the deacons beside him and said, "Instruct all the deacons and guardians to guard the various restrictions. The more important it is at this time, the more important it is. Nothing can happen." After giving the instructions, he looked at the Yuan Yu. Although he had not made a decision on this item, he felt that it would most likely fall into Luo Juan's hands. Although he had prepared in advance, it was difficult to say what would happen. Moreover, he did not expect that the appearance of this item would cause such a big movement. It could be said that as long as one was in Shenjing heaven, he would be able to see such a scene at this moment. At this moment, a disciple beside him unfolded a map and saw that there were rays of clear light converging toward the Xianjing division. He immediately said in shock, "Elder Tang, De Order, Luo Order, and many other cultivators are rushing here." In Tang Yu's senses, he could already feel a dull and oppressive feeling. Even without the disciple's reminder, he knew that many people with tyrannical mana were already eyeing the Xianjing division. He made a prompt decision and ordered, "Instruct all the altars to turn the defensive formation." The Yuan Yu hovered above for a long time, but did not fall. However, not long after, there was a rumbling sound coming from outside. It was obvious that someone was attacking the restrictions. Tang Yu was unmoved and only stared at the Yuan Yu. As time passed, the tremors outside grew stronger. Even the people on the altars could see the qi activity of the restrictions fluctuating like flowing water. Many people could not help but feel uneasy. At this moment, there was finally movement from the Yuan Yu. It slowly floated down, and under everyone's gaze, it first circled around Meng Hu, Go Han, and many other cultivators who cultivated the spirit of creation Tao technique. Finally, it flashed and landed steadily in front of Luo Juan. It was obvious that it had chosen its owner. At this moment, Luo Juan seemed to have sensed something. His eyelids moved slightly and he suddenly woke up. His eyes revealed a strange light, and he stretched out his hand to take the Yuan Yu. Not good. The people from the Yen order were shocked. Although they did not know how this person could break free from the ceiling restrictions, they all had a feeling that if he succeeded, something bad would definitely happen. At this moment, the black shadow behind Luo Juan was madly swallowing the surrounding Wei Li, and it was becoming more and more solid. Just as he was about to grab the Yuan Yu, a five-colored brilliance suddenly flashed in the air, and in an instant, the Yuan Yu disappeared. Tang Yu could not help but be shocked. Just as he was about to go forward to investigate, he heard Zhang Chan's voice. "Don't worry, my friend. The Yuan Yu has landed in a suitable place." Tang Yu's heart trembled. Anyone who could reach out and take away the Yuan Jade had to be an upper realm cultivator, and Zhang Chan was undoubtedly related to his sect's founder. In that case, it was obvious where this Yuan Jade had ended up. However, there was a more important matter to deal with at the moment. He said, "Everyone, don't panic. Everything is within the sect master's expectations. Open the realm gate immediately. There is no need to conceal it with the restrictions. We must let the people outside see it." There was also a realm gate in the branch altar, which could connect to the outside world and go straight back to the main altar. At this moment, he was not going to leave this place, but to tell the invaders that they could send the Fate Master away at any time. Even if they fought their way to the door, it would be useless. He also knew that this could not solve all the problems. There must be some people who would not give up, but it was enough as long as some people believed it. Things were as he expected. With the opening of the realm gate, the pressure on the outside suddenly decreased a lot. The various forces obviously knew that they had no chance. In order to avoid being counterattacked by the Yen Order, they all returned to their original places through the realm gate. At this moment, in the main hall of the Yen Order's main altar, after Gao Qingtu received the news, he immediately summoned a group of elders to discuss how to deal with the matter. Everyone believed that the Yanjiao sect would be attacked by various forces in the coming period of time. Because they had been in constant conflict with the various sects before, and now that the matter of the dimensional jade had come out, the conflict between them would definitely be triggered. Some elders suggested closing the realm gate and cutting off the various worlds. In this way, they would not be able to find trouble with the Yen Order. However, some people thought that it was not feasible because there were countless branches of the Yen Order, and it was impossible to abandon them all. Just as the elders were having different opinions, a disciple came to report that there was a decree from the founder on the spiritual tablet. Gao Qingtu did not dare to be negligent and went to the place where the spiritual tablet was located. When he read the decree, he found that this decree was different from the past. It did not say anything explicitly, but pointed out the location of a nameless heavenly domain that only the disciples of the Yen Order could enter. At first, he did not understand. He thought that the founder had pointed out that this place could be a place for the Yen Order to avoid the calamity. However, after thinking about it again, without his decree, outsiders would not be able to enter the main altar. It seemed unnecessary. After thinking deeply for a while, he nodded his head. In his heart, he somewhat understood. Even if the main altar of the Yen Order could prevent outsiders from entering, it was still a place where the people of the world could see. However, if a person was sent to the nameless place and appeared to be carrying the dimensional jade, the various forces would definitely shrink back if they saw it. After all, the Yen Order had obtained the dimensional jade. If a true Yang cultivator were to appear in the future, it would be very easy for him to find trouble with them. Thinking of this, his heart calmed down. However, he immediately felt that it was a pity that he could not really obtain the dimensional jade this time. However, he quickly let go of this thought. In his heart, he knew that although the method of the Yen Order did not require external objects, the higher one went, the more difficult it would be. It was undoubtedly more difficult to break through to the next realm than ordinary people. Now, even if the Yen Order obtained this thing, it was likely that no one could really use it to go to the upper realm. On the contrary, the Yen Order had the signboard of the dimensional jade. It might be able to use this to deter the various sects and make them fear. In the Qinghuan Palace of Xinyuan Heaven, Zhang Yan sat cross-legged with his palm open. The dimensional jade was floating there. He had already decided who this thing should belong to. It should be left for the third-generation sect master of Qinsong, Yuan Zhongzi. Of the 4 great chaotic domains left behind by the great underworld patriarch, 3 had upper realm cultivators, but only the void chaotic domain had none. The dimensional jade left in Xinyuan Hong Heaven was likely to be left for that person, but in the end, it was obtained by him. Although the mysteries of heaven were ever-changing, and what the patriarch thought might not be true, regardless of this, Yuan Zhongzi's contribution to the Qinsong school was also enough to obtain this thing. He smiled slightly, waved his sleeve, and the thing disappeared. In the void chaotic domain, when the third-generation sect Master Yuan Zhongzi was meditating, he suddenly felt something. He opened his eyes and looked, only to see a mysterious stone floating quietly in front of him. He could not sense it with his spiritual power. He thought for a moment and knew that it must have been sent by that person. After all, apart from that person, no one in Buxa Heaven would move this thing in front of him. His Taoist heart was firm, and his face was calm. There was no excitement or joy on his face, nor was there any pretentiousness. He stood up, bowed to Shen Yuan Tian, and then turned around, stretched out his hand, and with a wave of his sleeve, the dimensional jade was already in his palm. Chapter 2271. Gao Chengtu followed the instructions of the decree and opened the nameless world with great fanfare before sending an elder inside. Sure enough, as he expected, the various forces were originally restless, but after seeing the scene, they all retreated after searching for a long time without any results. After all, Yan Jiao had obtained the origin jade, and now there was someone who could help him preserve his cultivation. Regardless of whether the matter was successful or not, at least before the results were out, no one dared to offend him to death. After this incident, not only did the Yen sect resolve a crisis, but their relationship with the other sects also eased up a little. This was not because the original conflict no longer existed, but because the Yen sect might produce a true Yang Almighty in the future. This kind of deterrence was not small. Unless it was absolutely necessary, there was no need to turn hostile. Since the matters of the mystic mirror heaven were settled, all the sects returned to their respective places. Meng Hu also returned to Kunshan subaltar. When altar master He Xianren heard that Meng Hu was about to return, he was very happy. After Meng Hu left, the main altar appointed another elder to serve as the great protector. However, this elder's status was rather high, and he would naturally not relinquish his power like Meng Hu did. Although the two of them did not have any conflicts when they worked together, He Xianren always felt that he was being held back at every turn. He was not as compatible with Meng Hu as he was with him. At this time, the main altar also fulfilled its previous promise and sent the elder away, restoring Meng Hu's previous status as the great protector of the Kun beginning branch altar. Meng Hu himself did not care much about it. If there was a problem, he could deal with it, and if there wasn't, he could just muddle along. On the second day after He Xianren received the news, Meng Hu returned to the branch altar. Although He Xianren was curious as to why Meng Hu had returned a few days earlier than he had promised, it was still a good thing after all. Hence, He Xianren came to look for Meng Hu. After exchanging some pleasantries, He Xianren went straight to the point. Protector Meng, you came back at the right time. I have a favor to ask of you. Recently, I have tried every means possible to mend the relationship with many sects, especially many of the disciples of the sects who believe in the Tao of the spirit of creation. Simply cutting off their memories would easily ruin their future path. I heard that Protector Meng is especially good at resolving this method, so I came looking for you. However, I need to trouble Protector Meng here. Guardian Meng said righteously, we serve the sect with our lives, it's not hard at all. Altar Lord He, don't underestimate me. He Xianren was overjoyed. He cupped his hands in greeting and said, then I'll leave everything to Protector Meng. In his heart, however, he was overjoyed and said, Guardian Meng has always been reliable. After this matter, my Kun beginning branch will definitely be able to rope in these sections. In this way, we won't be in a difficult position in the future. After Zhang Yan obtained the vital energy of the Necropolis Lotus, he'd been constantly using it to pry into the Tao art behind it, and under his diligent cultivation his strength Tao art had improved slightly. He raised his head and looked at the crack in the void. The Whaley was surging and the robbery power was not as strong as before. Hence, it wouldn't be long before another great expert would descend. He had already seen it previously. This time, when he returned, the heavenly secrets would fall on the side of the great benefactors. After all, it was difficult for the spirit of creation to come again because of the previous venting. However, it was precisely because of this that the tribulation energy would become even weaker as the void crack grew larger, and the spirit of creation's main body might break through the barrier and follow closely behind him. So, he had to make the best use of this opportunity to make some preparations. From his point of view, although the great benefactors in the void were standing on the same side as him, he had never forgotten that the spirit of creation might exist. Because he couldn't identify it, he couldn't trust the great benefactors. In the end, he could only rely on himself. When another fellow Taoist returned, he must find a way to obtain the Qi of creation from Pauline so that he could perfect the Tao of strength. Although he didn't want to seize the spirit of creation from Pauline, he only wanted to borrow a bit of Qi. On the surface, it seemed easy, but no one knew what the other Taoists would think. Hence, if necessary, he might have to use forceful methods. As he was thinking, he suddenly had a feeling in his heart and noticed something. He turned his gaze towards Cheong Shao Tian. Inside the temple, Dan Yi was sitting in the clouds. Everything around him was the reflection of his mind. At this moment, he was unusually calm, which was enough to show that his state of mind was very stable. After a long period of training and deduction in the divine decree, he had decided to take that step and go to the upper realm to find the Dharma. When Zhang Yan first went to the God refinement realm, there was no one to guide him. He relied on himself to find the remnant of the Dharma left by the predecessors and his own deduction. In the end, he overcame all difficulties and found his way to the upper realm. But Danny didn't need to do that. He had seen Zhang Yan's doppelganger in the real world many times. Even if it was just a doppelganger, it was also formed by the Tao of the upper realm. The fact that Zhang Yan could let him see it was actually showing a part of the mysteries of the upper realm to him. Other than that, he also had an advantage that no one else had. He was the body of the spirit of creation. In terms of level, he was already above the true yang. Therefore, to others, this path was to break the shackles, climb the upper realm, and jump out of the world. But to him, it was just going back to the origin. If he was willing to follow the Tao, he could easily pass this stage. But this was also the difficulty. He couldn't abandon his own control. Instead, he had to fight against the bewitchment here and try his best not to lean towards the other side. After feeling that there was nothing else he needed, he spread out his mana. After all, he was the spirit of creation. Back then, Taoist 1K spent a lot of effort to steal Bu Su Tian's Weili to push himself forward. But when his consciousness arrived, he naturally borrowed the power to help him advance to the upper realm. At this moment, Dan Yi felt that he was surrounded by a force. This force was everywhere and unusually fierce. It was as if he was immersed in a boundless ocean. Only the ground under his feet could stand. It was as if he would be drowned if he was not careful. He had a feeling that he couldn't fall into it. Otherwise, he would definitely lose himself. Therefore, he used all his strength to protect himself. At this moment, a spiritual light suddenly appeared in front of him. It was faintly discernible and difficult to see clearly. For some reason, he understood that this was his own heart light. This was originally hidden beneath the boundless ocean of mighty power, but because of his perseverance, it had emerged. Even though it was still very weak and not worth mentioning compared to the ocean of mighty power, as long as this light didn't go out, he would be able to follow it to the other shore. After an unknown period of time, under his persistence, the murky Weili tide gradually became clear. His surroundings were also bright. He looked at the power of the same origin around him. He knew that he could choose to swallow these Weili and turn them into his own. Maybe then he could climb to the highest level that he could reach. But if he gave them up, then he would have to rely on himself to slowly cultivate in the future. To be able to avoid countless difficulties and directly enter the upper realm, and it didn't seem like there was much risk involved, this was undoubtedly an extremely great temptation to cultivators. But he didn't act rashly. He believed that only what he cultivated was his own. If he gave it to someone else, there would be hidden dangers. The rise of this thought meant that he had made a decision. The Weili tide outside disappeared. Not only that, everything, including everything in the world, retreated together. He floated out from within. At the same time, he felt a sense of ease rising from his body. Before this, he never thought that he would have such heavy shackles on him. Now that he was free, he felt refreshed. But when he floated to a certain point, he suddenly trembled. The scene before his eyes suddenly changed. He found himself in an unfamiliar place. There were a few Taoists standing there. They seemed to be arguing about something. He wanted to hear what they were talking about, but everything was blurry. He seemed to understand what they wanted to do, but he couldn't probe further. He could only watch these people and himself like a bystander. At this moment, his consciousness gradually became clear. In an instant, he understood endless mysteries. If he continued like this, he would be able to find the ultimate great Tao. However, he knew that this wasn't right because it wasn't something he deserved as well. So, he utilized his supreme willpower to stop this thought of his. In just an instant, the scene before his eyes had vanished, and it was replaced by countless dazzling starlight that appeared in the world. But he felt that he was gradually getting further away from these worlds. He suddenly understood that only by finding the way back could he return to this place. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to show himself again. With this thought, he made up his mind and followed the faint feeling in his heart. Although Zhang Yan sat in the Qinghuan Palace, he had always been paying attention to Dan. If he could guard his heart, there wouldn't be a problem for him to pass. But if he couldn't do this, he would no longer be Dan Yi. He would definitely destroy him and send his soul back to be reincarnated. But he didn't expect that he would gain something else from this observation. Because Dan Yi was seeking to break through in Bu Su Tian, and as the master of Bu Su Tian and the master of a part of the Great Tao, he was able to clearly see Dan Yi's process of seeking the Tao. At the same time, he confirmed a guess in his heart. The reason why the spirit of creation, Wei Li, wanted to start from the bottom and push the reincarnated body into the spirit refinement realm was actually because of this. Once the reincarnated body of the spirit of creation stepped into the spirit refinement realm, they would see the scene before the essence of creation shattered. That was a chance to completely accept the original body of the spirit of creation and comprehend the Tao. And what the spirit refinement realm saw was the truth. In other words, if the reincarnated body was a person who obeyed the Tao, then it was very likely that the reincarnated body would instantly obtain the Tao that the spirit of creation possessed when it was at its peak. Possessing the Tao meant possessing the ability. This was equivalent to the complete reincarnation of the spirit of creation. Although it was only a fragment of the spirit of creation and was far inferior to the original body, even if it appeared in the spirit refinement realm for a moment, it was still terrifying enough. The original body of the spirit of creation could rely on itself to fight against all the great virtue. With the current strength of the spirit refinement realm, it was obviously unable to resist. What was even more terrifying was that even if one could escape, the original body would most likely be able to break through the robbery power and return. Then, everything would be irreversible. Zhang Yan's eyes were deep and serene. It seemed that they were here to think of a way to deal with the spirit of creation. Even if the spirit of creation didn't really land on the original body, it was still thinking of ways to swallow them. He pondered for a moment. All the reincarnated bodies of the spirit of creation, as long as they submitted to the Tao, were undoubtedly a potential threat. Since that was the case, then he must find a way to cut off the path of this generation's advancement. Chapter 2272. Zhang Yan understood very well that if it wasn't for the jade of Zhou Huan blocking the way, it would have been almost impossible to stop the reincarnated bodies of the spirits of creation from ascending to the upper realm. At this moment, he was also thinking about a problem. Was Yuan Jade so difficult to appear because it was like creation? Was it born like this? Or was there a powerful being who had sensed the change in the situation with the spirits of creation and made such arrangements in advance? However, in order to achieve this, he would have to change the rules and regulations. However, the great virtue and the spirits of creation each had their own great paths. Logically speaking, at least one needed to be proficient in all great paths and suppress both. Just now was the only thing that could be done. The only thing that could be done was the spirits of creation itself. Because whether it was the land of creation, the spirits of creation, or the Yuan Jade, they were all born from it. However, the spirits of creation were only given spirituality later, so unless someone borrowed its power, it would not take the initiative to do this. This question could not be answered now, but he believed that even with the Yuan Jade as a barrier, they could not relax because Bu Su Tian and the Mirror Lake could produce the Yuan Jade. It must be known that there were many places of creation that had not appeared in front of them. Not only did they contain Yuan Jade, but there were also fragments of the spirits of creation. Especially now that the spirits of creation Whaley were scattered among them, it could be said that all three were present. Who knew when a fated person would appear? It was fine that they did not guard against this in the past, but now that they had sensed it, it meant that this was very likely to happen, and they had to pay attention to it. After thinking for a moment, he moved his mind and created a doppelganger. In an instant, it appeared in the world created by Fengdu and the others. Fengdu and the other four hurriedly appeared to welcome him. Xiangju said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, do you have something to tell us?" Zhang Yan said, "There is something I need to discuss with you." He told them what he saw, but Fengdu did not respond. Xiangju and the others were shocked. They did not expect the spirits of creation Whaley to have such a trick. Xiangju discussed with the others and said, "Thank you for telling us. It is difficult for us to take care of those unknown places. We will not allow the spirits of creation to gain power in our domain." At this moment, Dan Yi was returning to the modern world, but he felt that Whaley were pressing down on him from all directions. If he did not find a way to resist, he would be cut off from the modern world. Not only that, there was another force that continued to tempt him, telling him that he would be able to ascend to the heavens in a single step if he went there, but he ignored it. At this point, he knew what he had to do. As long as he didn't panic, the creation spirit Whaley wouldn't affect him much. As long as he guarded his heart, he wouldn't deviate from the right path. Following that feeling, he easily found his way back to Bu Shutian. Although he had experienced a lot when he broke through the barrier to the present world, it was just an instant. But at this moment, when he looked up, he was no longer limited to Bu Shutian. Instead, he looked into the void and observed the world. He sighed with emotion and said, "Put away the universe in your sleeves, live up to the world." After chanting, he stood silently for a moment and then set off for Xianyuan heaven. Although he had cultivated a superior technique, he had many doubts in his heart. Perhaps only Zhang Yan could answer them. This time, Zhang Yan looked thoughtfully at Dan Yi's experience of achieving the Tao. After all, the spirit of creation was born into the world, so his achievements were different from his. He had created the world himself, but the spirit of creation had gone far away and returned to the world. It was similar to the great virtue-seeking Tao. But considering that the level of his foundation was beyond that of ordinary cultivators, there was nothing strange about it. Seeing that the spirit of creation was coming to Qinghuan Palace, he smiled and said to the spirit of creation, "When fellow Danny arrives, there is no need to report, just invite him directly into the hall." Not long after, he saw Dan Yi enter the hall. This time, he didn't reveal his incarnation like before. Instead, he welcomed Dan Yi with his real body. He nodded and said, "Congratulations, fellow Taoist, on reaching the upper realm." Danny looked up and saw Zhang Yan standing there with qi surging under his body and 5 lights shining behind him. Although he looked more real than before, he still gave Dan Yi an unfathomable feeling. Knowing that there was still a gap between them, Dan Yi stepped forward and cupped his hands, saying, "Thank you for pointing out the right path, fellow Taoist, so I did not delay the results of my cultivation." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist Dan Yi, there is no need to be so polite. This is your own fate. If you could not guard your heart and not be influenced by external evils, you would not have been able to pass through this gate safely." Dan Yi said solemnly, "Fellow Taoist is the master of Bu Su Tian, so you can rely on yourself to cultivate, but Bu Su Tian blocked all forces. This is all fellow Taoist's ability, how can I not understand?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Since fellow Taoist has reached the upper realm, I should meet with all of you." As the sound of his voice faded, the silhouettes of Taoists appeared in the hall one after another. Each of them had a solemn demeanor and were surrounded by Dao Qi. All of them bowed to Dan Yi and said, Greetings, fellow Taoist. Dan Yi knew at a glance that these were all Taoists who had reached the spirit refinement realm. Just now, when he found Bu Su Tian, he could faintly feel the Weili among these people. He immediately bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoists." These people only appeared to greet this newly accomplished Taoist, and after that, they disappeared one by one. Dan Yi looked at Zhang Yan and bowed solemnly. He said, "Fellow Taoist, I have many questions to ask." Zhang Yan smiled and gestured with his hand. He said, "Fellow Taoist, please take a seat. You can take your time to ask." On the other side, Fu Qingming, Michihito Ichito, and Taoist Wan Kei were cultivating when they suddenly sensed that Dan Yi had disappeared from their perception. They clearly had an impression of him, but it was as if this person had never existed in this world, and they couldn't make any calculations. But after a moment, the impression of this person became clear again, as if he had returned to the world, but just like Zhang Yan, he became elusive and unpredictable. Dan Yi had already informed the three of them before he started cultivating, so they couldn't help but realize that this person had most likely reached the upper realm and achieved the true Tao. The three of them sighed. Their fellow Taoist who cultivated with them in the past had transcended the world, and they, due to various reasons, had no hope of reaching the upper realm. Michihito Ichito knew that his foundation wasn't strong enough, so he had long given up on it. Fu Qingming and Taoist Wan Kei, on the other hand, had come back to life, and it was all thanks to Zhang Yan's Weili molding, so it was impossible for them to reach the upper realm. Fu Qingming said, "The memorial tablets in this world should be rearranged." Michihito Ichito didn't care about this. If he wanted to, the will of the world could be usurped and changed by them. If it wasn't to restrict the demons and other races, he wouldn't care about these small details. He said, "That's how it should be." Taoist Wan Kei didn't say a word. He had come back to life and had no hope of reaching the upper realm, but he was eternally present, so he didn't care about these things. On the other side, Bai Wei, Deng Zhang, and the 6 demon masters also noticed the change in Dan Yi's aura. After he disappeared, he shone again, but it was vast and immeasurable. It was obvious that he had ascended to another level. The few of them immediately felt a great threat, so they gathered their divine wills together to find a countermeasure. Qi Yao said with a serious expression, "This person has gone to the upper realm." Heng Jing panicked and said, "We have always been enemies with the human path. If this person is against us, what should we do?" Deng Zhang said in a deep voice, "It doesn't have to be like this. Why would someone who has transcended look back at the mortal world? If this person is against us, then we won't be able to sit here anymore." Bai Wei sighed and said, "If that's the case, then it's fine. What we need to worry about now is if someone among us has the fortune to see the door to the upper realm. If this person tries to stop us, then we will be suppressed forever." Deng Zhang also frowned. Those who cultivated the emotionless Tao only sought the great Tao. However, if the door to the great Tao was blocked by someone, it was something he couldn't tolerate. However, he couldn't do anything about it now. Qi Yao was also gloomy. The human path was already one step ahead and had the upper hand. If Dan Yi tried to stop them, then they could only be suppressed by the human path forever and never be able to rise again. After the four of them discussed for a while, they couldn't come up with a solution. In the end, they could only decide that as long as the human path didn't provoke them, they wouldn't make a move. After the demon masters, Bai Wei, and Deng Zhang separated, Ling Cho saw everyone's gloomy expression and smiled. "Is everyone worried about the upper realm? I thought there was no need to worry about it." Qi Yao looked at him and said, "Fellow Taoist, just now, you aren't saying a word. Could it be that you have a solution to this predicament?" Ling Cho smiled. "I can't, but someone else can." Qi Yao's eyes flickered as if he had thought of something. Ling Cho looked at everyone present and said, "Everyone, we aren't like Bai Wei and Deng Zhang. Even if we can't find someone in the upper realm to help us, we have our own people to rely on." At this point, his tone became heavier. Back then, Demon Lord Qizhou mysteriously disappeared and hasn't returned for a long time. In my opinion, it's very likely that he's gone to the upper realm as well. Heng Jing asked doubtfully, "But how do you know that Demon Lord Qizhou hasn't passed the barrier?" No one knew what the path to the upper realm was like. However, from what they knew, Dan Yi seemed to be able to return after transcending, but Demon Lord Chizhou had disappeared without a trace. This was really hard to believe. However, Ling Cho smiled and said, "Everyone, why do you think that just now, that person who's achieved the upper realm doesn't come to deal with us? Perhaps it's not because he's disdainful, but because of Demon Lord Chizhou." Everyone's expressions changed. Qi Yao pondered for a moment and said, "It's not like there's no way to confirm it. Why don't we set up an altar and see if Demon Lord Chizhou has any response?" The other demon masters thought about it and felt that this was a good idea. In the past, Demon Lord Chizhou had no relationship with them and they couldn't see through him. Therefore, even if he disappeared, they didn't look into the reason. Now, however, they hoped that he had really gone to another realm as they thought. That way, they would still have some hope and not be suppressed by the human path forever. More importantly, if this was true, they might be able to use this opportunity to learn about the wonders of the upper realm. Chapter 2273. After Ling Jun and the others decided on this matter, they were afraid that the situation would change if they delayed any longer, so they immediately separated to prepare the sacrificial altar. In fact, everyone still had doubts in their hearts, but under the threat of an upper realm almighty, they knew that they were powerless to struggle at all. Their life and death were in the hands of someone else at any time. This made them feel great fear, and Demon Lord Chizhou seemed to be their only hope. Speaking of all the demon masters in the past, even Qi Yao and the others did not have a good relationship with Demon Lord Chizhou. This was because no one knew what he was thinking. Not only that, when the demon masters faced him, they always felt an inexplicable pressure, so they always avoided him. Even when he disappeared, they did not feel that anything was wrong. Instead, they felt a little more relaxed. They did not expect that they would take the initiative to collude with him and ask for his help. After everything was ready, the 6 of them burned incense to pay their respects and silently recited his name in their hearts. However, this continued for a long time, but they did not receive any response. Ling Jun and Qi Yao did not say anything, but Heng Jing and the others hesitated. Was this Demon Lord Chizhou really dead, or was he unwilling to respond after receiving their sacrificial offerings? After waiting for a long time, seeing that there was still no result, Heng Jing could not help but look at Ling Jun and said, "I'm afraid this matter is not as you think?" Ling Jun said seriously, "I don't think so, but our attitude is not humble enough." He looked at the crowd and said, "Fellow Taoists, pay respects to him as an equal. Why would Demon Lord Chizhou pay attention to us? Since it is to pay our respects, we should pay our respects." Qi Yao and the others furrowed their brows. In the past, Chizhou had always treated them as equals, but now, they had to pay their respects to him without confirming the situation. They instinctively wanted to refuse such a request. If the result was not as they expected, wouldn't they lose face and become a joke? Ling Jun did not care about what they thought. He first prostrated himself in front of the sacrificial altar. Even Jian Tong and Ji Yu, who had always been close to him, were a little hesitant. Seeing this, Qi Yao pondered for a moment and said in a deep voice, "No matter what, Demon Lord Chizhou is the first demon lord in the world. We all use him as a reference when we stay in this world. There's no harm in paying our respects. Besides, we don't have much of a choice." Between losing face and the threat to their lives, the various demon masters naturally knew which was more important. Even if they were very unwilling, they could only hope for the slightest chance at this moment. So, they all knelt down. At this time, Ling Du suddenly felt as if a gaze from a very distant place fell on him, causing his spirit to tremble involuntarily. After he noticed these changes, he couldn't help but feel extremely excited. This undoubtedly showed that his deduction was correct, so he hurriedly bowed once more and said loudly, "Demonic Ancestor Chizhou, we juniors are here to pray." Presently, there's a great figure of the mortal Tao that has attained an exalted technique, and we naturally think that if we have enmity towards him, then we're unable to go against him, so we've come to pray. At this moment, the various demon masters also noticed the abnormality, and their hearts trembled. At the same time, the scene in front of them changed, and they discovered that they had stopped on a huge continent. However, when they sensed it again, they couldn't help but be horrified. They were actually stopped on an incomparably huge finger. After Qi Yao recovered from his initial shock, he also knelt down again and said, "We greet demonic ancestor Qizhou." This kind of ability was definitely not something that the previous demon Lord Qizhou could do, so he immediately changed the way he addressed this person and called him demonic ancestor like Ling Du did. At this moment, the various demon masters suddenly felt countless words and images surging into their minds. It was abnormally chaotic, and they couldn't distinguish them at all. All the demon masters knew that this was because the difference between their levels was too great. They saw too many things at once, but they couldn't understand them at the moment, which led to this situation. They wanted to transmit something, but at this moment, each of them felt a force pressing down on them, and they were incomparably insignificant before this force. Fortunately, this situation didn't last for too long. Just when they felt that they couldn't bear it anymore and were about to be crushed, the scene around them suddenly collapsed. In the blink of an eye, they found themselves back in front of the sacrificial altar. When Qi Yao and the others recovered from their bewilderment, they all revealed expressions of lingering fear. Heng Jing said in confusion, "Just now, that person should be demonic ancestor Qizhou. But in the just now situation, what exactly does this person mean?" Ling Du smiled and said, "Everyone, I think there's no need to pay too much attention to this matter. Even if demonic ancestor Qizhou doesn't say anything, it's enough for him to accept us as tributes." Qi Yao said in a low voice, "That's true. This person doesn't need to promise us anything. He's already been generous enough to meet us. Moreover, it's not like we didn't gain anything just now." All the demon masters present nodded to themselves. Although none of them had reached the peak of the true yang level, they had now seen a true upper realm technique. Moreover, the other party was a demon master who had become an almighty. This would undoubtedly be of great help to their cultivation in the future. Ling Du suggested, "We should build an altar and enshrine the demonic ancestors' memorial tablet on it. We should also inform our disciples to show our respect to the demonic ancestor." Qi Yao nodded and said, "That's right." All the demon masters also voiced their agreement. They understood that this wasn't just for worship. As long as the demonic ancestors' memorial tablet was here, they would still have the confidence to fight against the human path. Zhang Yan was currently conversing with Dan Yi in Qinghuan Palace. He didn't pay much attention to the unusual movements of the demon masters in the world. However, he, Wei Li, responded spontaneously and obediently to his wishes. When he sensed the changes in the real world, he cast a glance over and then retracted his gaze. These demon masters and foreign species were still useful for now. Not mentioning the matter of stirring up karma, if the human path didn't have external threats, then there would definitely be internal strife. Therefore, keeping them was more useful than getting rid of them. Dan Yi was currently sitting on the guest seat. He had previously asked Zhang Yan many questions about spirit refinement cultivators. However, what puzzled him the most was the last scene he saw. Therefore, he asked about it again. Zhang Yan pondered for a while and said, "What fellow Taoists saw should be the scene where the Vedantas bestowed the spirit of creation with the spirit of creation in order to pursue the great Tao." He told him about the cause and effect of this. Following this matter, he roughly explained the current situation within the void of all beings. After listening, Dan Yi said in a daze, "So there are so many reasons." He was also a little worried. "I can still feel the Wei Li that is everywhere. It must be from the true body of the spirit of creation that fellow Taoist mentioned. I can still maintain myself now, but if it really comes, I don't know if I can protect myself?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Although fellow Taoist is the spirit of creation that was born into the world, you have achieved success based on your own Tao. It has already formed its own pattern. As long as your original heart is not biased, then you can no longer be restrained. Just like those Wei Li that were chased away, the true body of the spirit of creation lost that part forever." After Dan Yi achieved success, he could also strip a part of the power from the true body. Therefore, the higher the cultivation of the person, the more Weili that could be snatched away. This was also one of the reasons why Zhang Yan was willing to let him enter the spirit refinement state. If Dan Yi could achieve Vedantas, then the weakening of the spirit of creation would be no less than destroying another Weili incarnation. Now, after discussing with Fengdu and the others, they felt that it was better to let it go. All the bodies of the spirit of creation that were born into the world, as long as they succumbed to the Tao, then they must find a way to cut off their future path and force them to cultivate their own Tao instead of letting them be used by the true body of the spirit of creation. As for those spirit of creation that were immersed in the unknown world, due to the collision and blending of the Weili between the spirit refinement state in the void, as long as they stepped into the spirit refinement state, there would definitely be signs. Then, no matter who was the first to notice it, they must find a way to beat it back, or at least find a way to separate it from the world, and definitely not let it fall into the spirit of creation. After Dan Yi asked for advice, many of his doubts were solved. After thanking Zhang Yan, he left the hall and went to observe the spirit of creation. After he left, Zhang Yan took a look at the crack in the void, and his eyes flickered. The Weili of the spirit of creation was temporarily suppressed, and the spirit of creation's changes calmed down. However, this kind of situation would not last for too long, and the changes would be in the near future. However, the true body of the spirit of creation was too strong. If the Vedantas who returned were not complete Weili, then it would not fundamentally change the balance of power between the two sides. Therefore, he did not expect the person who returned to be outstanding. As long as he could smoothly obtain Pauline's chi activity from the other party, it would be fine. He retracted his gaze and sat in meditation. After an unknown period of time, he felt a strange movement outside. He looked up and saw that there was a force behind the robbery power that was about to break through. At the same time, the spirit of creation was also affected by the Weili. He had seen such a scene many times, but he noticed that this time, there were a few Weili that fell, and they did not fall at the same time, but one after another. However, the robbery power suffered a series of breakthroughs in a short period of time, and the spirit of creation might follow because of this, so he had to delay it here. Therefore, he immediately sent a message to Hongdu and the others, asking them to sacrifice the Weili with him. They could let 1 or 2 people return first, and as for those who did not fall into the spirit of creation, they could first stop them. At this moment, there was a flash of spiritual light in the void, and 2 Taoists walked out of the void. The 2 of them felt that the spirit of creation had been affected by the Weili, so they summoned Pauline, who had fallen into the void, and sent the power into her. Xiangju and the others felt that it was both familiar and strange. They knew that it was because of the incomplete memories, so they went forward to greet the 2 and asked, "May I know how to address the 2 of you?" The Taoist standing on the right laughed, cupped his fist, and said in a loud voice, "From the beginning to the end, there is no form, and the light of wisdom can determine the name. I am the name of the elephant, greeting the fellow Taoists." The Taoist on the left had a cold expression, cupped his fist, and said, "Silence is not emptiness. The emptiness is one. The emptiness comes to obtain the Tao. I am the Taoist name Ing Kong." Speaking up to this point, he looked at Xiangju and the others, and said with a slightly displeased tone, "But I have a question. Besides us, there are other Taoists who will also return. Why do you want to stop us?" Chapter 2274. Xiangju glanced at Hongdo and saw that Hongdo was disdainful and had no intention of explaining himself. Xiangju had no choice but to step forward and say, "Fellow Taoists, the void silence has been mostly broken after we returned, and the resistance of the tribulation power has been greatly weakened. It will not be a good thing if the creation spirit returns in its true form." As Ing Kong and Xiang Ming returned, their mighty force collided with everyone else. They gradually gained some understanding of the situation in the void silence. Ing Kong shook his head and said, "It is precisely because of this that we have to let those 2 fellow Taoists return successfully. Otherwise, they might not be able to compete for the spirit of creation next time. If those 2 are unable to return successfully, it will instead weaken our strength here." Xiangju smiled and said, Fellow Taoist, your words are somewhat reasonable, but forgive us for not following your words. Ing Kong stared at him and said, "What is the reason?" He could tell that Ing Kong did not simply disagree with his opinion, but there were other reasons. Xiang Ju said, "The creation spirit can steal our Daos, and we have long suspected that it has stolen our Daos and borrowed our Daos to enter the world." He looked at the two and said, "Before we understand the situation, please forgive us for not trusting the two of you." Ing Kong said with a serious expression, "We have nothing to do with the creation spirit, and our Daos were not stolen by it." Xiang Ju shook his head and said, "This is not something that can be proven with words. Even we can't clear our suspicions now, and the two of you are no exception." "Oh," Xiang Ming said with a laugh, "doesn't it mean that everyone can be borrowed by the spirit of creation? Then how can we trust each other?" Xiang Ju said, "Not all of you are like that, but at least one of you is trustworthy. That's because this one is a creation spirit that attained Tao after it was shattered. The creation spirit's original body was already trapped in the power of robbery, so it's not possible that he's just borrowing it." Ing Kong frowned and shook his head. Although this Taoist Xianyuan achieved Tao after the creation spirit was broken, it does not prove that he is not a suspect. Xiang Ju smiled. "If the two of you have any questions, feel free to discuss it with fellow Taoist Xianyuan. At the very least, before fellow Taoist Xianyuan agrees, we will not withdraw our powers." At this moment, Wei Ming said, "Fellow Taoists, in the past, for the sake of seeking for the missing great Tao, the creation of a spirit was able to appear. Now that the Tao technique has appeared, why don't the two of you search for the Tao technique first? After you're able to improve, it won't be too late to ask the rest of the Taoists to return." Ing Kong and Xiang Ming looked at each other. They could tell that Taoist Xianyuan was the leader, at least on the surface. Ing Kong pondered for a moment and said, "I would like to meet Brother Xianyuan. I wonder if you can introduce me to him?" Xiang Ju pointed and smiled. "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan lives in that Busha heaven. You two can go and meet him." The two of them looked in the direction he pointed, and their eyes narrowed. Although there were countless worlds within the desolation, only that place was the brightest, and it was the place where they could sense the greatest amount of creation essence. With a thought, the two of them arrived in front of Bushutian and said, "Is fellow Xianyuan here? The two of us have something to ask. Can you show yourself?" The two of them waited for a moment, and then they saw a young Taoist walking out from Bushutian. His body was covered with a black robe, and Xian Qi was surging under his feet. Behind him, there were 5 faint lights. The two of them sensed that this person's aura was unfathomable, and their hearts shuddered. When they came, they already knew that this person was not simple, since he had such prestige among his peers. But when they actually met, they still felt that they had underestimated him. The two of them hurriedly bowed and said, "Greetings, Brother Xianyuan." Zhang Yan also bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoists." He smiled and said, "I know why the two of you are looking for me. Since both of you have different opinions, why don't we have a duel to prove our Tao techniques?" The reason he proposed this was not a simple contest of mana. Among the Vedanta, the Whaley had a higher understanding of Tao techniques than others, and they could see more secrets of creation, so their words were naturally more reasonable. Ing Kong and Xiang Ming discussed it in their divine will, and they agreed with this idea. Compared to persuading the other party with words, this method was undoubtedly more direct and effective, and it could also avoid more disputes. Ing Kong took a step forward and said politely, "Then let I experience fellow Taoists' brilliance first." Zhang Yan smiled and shook his head, saying, "Both of you can fight together." Hearing his words, Ing Kong and Xiang Ming did not refuse, and they agreed to it. They could see that this person was not simple, and most importantly, he had Bu Su Tian behind him, so the power he could use was not small. It was not likely that one of them could win, so they were just being polite just now. Moreover, the two of them were not without selfish motives. It was not difficult for them to see that Zhang Yan had the highest status among the fellow Taoists that had returned, and everyone was convinced by him. If they could win against Zhang Yan, they could prove their strength, and at the same time, it would not be difficult for them to make their fellow Taoists lower their heads, and they could take the lead. On the other side, Xiangju and the others also saw that the two of them were about to fight against Zhang Yan, and they could not help but pay attention to the battle. Hong Du sneered and said, "You overestimate yourselves." Xiangju said to the others, "Without looking at their techniques and just looking at the Whaley's aura, these two are actually a level stronger than us." Although the others did not say anything, they all admitted this point. There were also differences between great virtues. Generally speaking, the more powerful a great virtue was, the later they would return. However, there were also exceptions. For example, Wei Ming had already made preparations to return. As for Feng Du, although he was much stronger than them, he had been consciously lured over by a few people. It could be roughly assumed that the people who returned later were slightly stronger. However, the great virtue battle didn't just look at mighty strength, it also looked at the usage of one's Tao. Unless one had reached the level of Feng Du, even without the lotus of good fortune, one would still be able to deal with them. However, Ying Kong and Xiang Ming were clearly not at that level. While the few of them were conversing, Xiang Ming had already made the first move. He circulated his mana, and boundless starlight spread out behind him. The brilliance of the world around him fell into it, and it turned into threads of light. This thread did not care about speed or quantity. It was the manifestation of a Tao. If one could not break it, then when one was bound by it, he would be able to see one's true name. The so-called original name wasn't a taboo name, but the mark of existence in everything. If he were to find the source of it, then his opponent wouldn't be able to keep any secrets from him, and even the Tao arts he possessed would be completely useless against him. Xiangju and the others looked slightly serious. They could all see that it was not easy to resist such a Tao. Moreover, as long as Xiang Ming won once, he could win again and again, so that one would never be able to win against him. At this moment, Ying Kong also shook his sleeve, and a ball of mana spread out. Although he did not participate in the battle, the qi was vast and deep. Just by appearing, it felt like everything in the world was falling into it. At this moment, apart from Feng Du, Xiangju and the others were all surprised. It was not difficult for them to tell that the qi was extremely mysterious. Any external force that fell on it would be blocked by it. As long as the Tao was not broken, it would be able to withstand the pressure no matter how much force came. The Tao that the two of them practiced was extraordinary. One was attacking, and the other was defending. When the two of them worked together, it was like the embrace of yin and yang. It was almost perfect. At this moment, Xiangju and the others had to admit that if they went up to fight with the two of them, they might not necessarily lose. However, with their current methods, they would not be able to do anything to them. Heng Wu sighed. So the two of them have such confidence. No wonder they were unwilling to give in to fellow Xian Yuan. Zhang Yan looked at Ying Kong and Xiang Ming's methods, and his eyes flickered. In reality, no matter how profound their Tao was, he could definitely break it in a Whaley way. He only needed to punch them with his strength body. However, even though this could intimidate the two of them, the method was too violent. It might not be able to convince the two of them. Therefore, he did not use such a method. Instead, he directly fought with them using Tao. With a thought, two rays of sword light flew up and slashed at the two of them. Ying Kong raised his magical energy and was about to retract the sword light that was slashing towards him. However, his expression suddenly changed. The sword light actually tore apart his magical energy and slashed towards him. Xiang Ming had originally left the defense to Ying Kong, but he did not expect that he would not be able to block the sword light. He instantly determined that it was useless to give up on attacking and defending. Instead, he fell into a passive position. The only way to win was to urge his offense. However, the result was beyond his expectations. When the light landed on Zhang Yan's body, it actually passed through him without touching him at all. At the same time, the sword light had already slashed into the two of them. The two of them could not help but take a step back. However, the sword light did not contain any killing intent, so the two of them did not lose any Tao. The two of them were silent for a moment. They knew that they had lost the battle and that their opponent had shown mercy. However, the problem was that they did not even know how they lost. It was obvious that their opponent's ability had far exceeded their understanding. Xiang Ming cupped his hands and said with admiration, "Fellow's Tao is profound and far above ours. We naturally know when to advance and when to retreat. From now on, we are willing to follow your wishes." Ing Kong said, "I hope that I will have the opportunity to ask for your help in the future." Previously, they had doubts about Zhang Yan's identity. However, since Zhang Yan had defeated them in this battle, most of their suspicions could be dispelled. The reason was very simple. If the other party was a creation spirit, then with his strength, there was no need for him to talk nonsense with them. He could just directly use his strength to suppress them. Zhang Yan smiled and did not say anything. At this moment, Xiang Ming thought for a moment and said, "Fellow, just now, do you think that there might be a creation spirit among the people who returned?" Zhang Yan said, "Fellow, if you have anything to say, feel free to say it." Xiang Ming's divine will said, "If it really is a creation spirit, I might be able to help you identify it." Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows and said, "Oh? Then what do you plan to do?" Xiang Ming said, "The method of borrowing the creation spirit looks flawless on the surface. However, everything has a name. Even if it looks the same on the surface, it is still fundamentally different. If I can see its name, I might be able to find it." You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.